Draw a line from the English Channel, the grey, cold strip of water off the coast of Belgium, and pull it south, past the ruined villages of Flanders, through the shattered forests of the Argonne, down through the chalk hills of Champagne, until it hits the Swiss Alps. 475 miles. That line is the Western Front, and for 4 years, 1 month and 14 days, the combined industrial weight of the most powerful nations on Earth was aimed at moving it. By how much it moved, at what cost, and why it barely moved at all. That is the story tonight. Most people have a feeling about the Western Front without knowing the numbers. The feeling is right, but the numbers are worse. 1,219,201 total casualties at the Somme, 976,000 at Verdun, 275,000 British and Commonwealth casualties at Passchendaele alone. A battle fought in rain so unrelenting, in mud so deep, that men and horses drowned in shell craters without anyone firing at them. The Germans lost approximately 220,000 at Passchendaele, trying to hold the same waterlogged ground. And when it was all over, the Western Front had moved, in places, by a few miles. At the Somme, the Allies gained 6 miles of depth across a 20-mile front, at a cost of 1 casualty for every 12 inches of ground. 12 inches. The length of a standard ruler. 1 man's worth of European earth. The week before I finished reading John Keegan's The Face of Battle, a book I'd been circling for years before I finally committed to it, I had to put it down after the Somme chapter and just sit there. Not because of the death toll, which I already knew, because of the silence between the numbers, the gap where military logic and human reality collide, and produce something neither category has proper language for. That gap is what this entire video is about. By the late autumn of 1914, something strange had happened along that line stretching from Belgium to Switzerland. 2 armies, each with millions of men and thousands of artillery pieces, had effectively cancelled each other out. The German right-wing advance through Belgium had stalled at the Marne River in September. The French and British counter-offensive had pushed back but could not break through. And so both sides, having run out of tactical answers, did the one thing military doctrine had never seriously prepared for. They dug. What began as individual foxholes in September became a continuous network by December. 3 parallel lines of trenches on each side, connected by communication trenches, protected by aprons of barbed wire that stretched in some places 12 rows deep, backed by concrete machine gun positions that could fire 600 rounds per minute into any open ground between the lines. 35,000 miles of trench were eventually dug across the entire front, 12,000 miles held by Allied forces alone. The distance from London to Sydney is just under 10,000, 600 miles. The Allies dug more trench than that. Living inside that system did things to men that no training had anticipated. 97% of soldiers in the trenches carried lice, not occasionally, not on the worst days, but constantly, on their skin, in their clothing, breeding in the seams of their uniforms, at a rate that made any attempt at removal feel almost comically futile. The rats numbered in the millions. They were not small rats. They grew fat on the contents of the shell craters and the unrecovered dead, and they did not particularly fear the men sharing their environment. Trench foot, caused by standing in cold water for days at a time, rotted tissue from the inside, sometimes necessitating amputation. Trench fever, spread by the same lice that nobody could eliminate, hospitalized hundreds of thousands. And this was the quiet time. This was what the Western Front felt like between battles, on an ordinary Tuesday that would never make any history book. What makes the Western Front so difficult to look at directly, and I think this is why it keeps producing some of the most devastating literature and film of the 20th century, is not the violence by itself. Violence in war is expected. What fractures the usual framework is the ratio. The ratio between the effort and the result. Between the number of shells fired and the ground gained. between the planning sophistication of the generals and the reality experienced by the private who climbed over the parapet. At the Somme, British artillery fired 1,500,000 shells in the 7 days before the infantry assault on the 1st of July, 1916. The German deep dugouts, some cut 30 feet into the chalk, absorbed most of it. When the British infantry went over the top at 7:30 in the morning, they walked into machine gun fire from positions that had survived a week of continuous bombardment. 57,470 casualties by nightfall. The artillery had not done what the planners calculated it would do. The men paid the difference. That accounting runs through every major engagement on the Western Front from 1914 to 1918. Ypres, the Chemin des Dames, Arras, Cambrai. Every battle followed the same arithmetic. Enormous expenditure, modest ground, catastrophic human cost. The Germans lost an average of 1,300 men every single day of the war. Not on the worst days, the average, including the quiet sectors, including the days when nothing was scheduled. The British Empire lost 900,000 soldiers on the Western Front across the 4 years. France lost 1,150,000. The German army, fighting a war on 2 fronts, lost more than 2 million dead from all theaters combined, and still held the Western Front with enough coherence to launch the most concentrated artillery barrage in recorded history. 3,500,000 shells in 5 hours during the spring offensive of March 1918. What is waiting for you in this video is not just a battle-by-battle account. It is an excavation of how a military system built by the finest engineering minds in Europe locked itself into a geometry it could not escape, and what that geometry cost the human beings who lived inside it. From the generals who bled ink across maps in warm headquarters, to the men who spent their days standing in ankle-deep water, staring at 15 yards of barbed wire and a set of sandbags, knowing that somewhere behind those sandbags, another man was staring back. We are going to walk through every phase of the Western Front. The opening sprint that became a crawl, the years that stalled into something no war had quite looked like before, the moments of tactical invention that briefly cracked the deadlock open, and the 100-day offensive that finally broke the German army and ended it. There is so much here that most documentaries leave behind because it slows things down. We are not slowing down, we are going deeper. And if you are at the point tonight where your eyes are already going heavy, where the day is sitting on your chest, and this is just the sound you want underneath the quiet, stay with it. Let the story move around you. The Western Front is the kind of history that gets under your skin differently when you're not trying to hold it all together, when you're just letting it settle. You don't need to catch every number. They'll find you. This is the entire history of the Western Front, 1914 to 1918. The map that murdered a continent. There is a document, 26 pages long, written in careful German bureaucratic script, that a great many historians have blamed for killing a generation. It was composed in December of 1905 by a 72-year-old field marshal named Alfred von Schlieffen, who was by then largely desk-bound and ailing, and it described, in remarkable operational detail, how Germany could defeat France in approximately 6 weeks by sending its armies sweeping through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, enveloping Paris from the west, and forcing a French surrender before Russia could mobilize in the east. The document has been called a masterpiece of staff planning. It has also been called a fantasy, a piece of institutional mythology, and, by the German historian Gerhard Ritter, who spent years hunting down the actual archive before publishing his findings in 1956, a plan that went through no fewer than 6 separate drafts, each one subtly different from the version that Germany's generals later claimed to have followed. That gap between what was planned and what was executed is, in my view, the most important unresolved question on the entire Western Front. Because if the Schlieffen Plan was never quite the clockwork instrument of precision that its defenders insisted, then the 4 years of killing that followed were not the product of a machine that failed. They were the product of a machine that was never fully built in the first place. Alfred von Schlieffen died in 1913. He never saw what happened when his concept met the real world. By the time German infantry crossed the Belgian frontier in early August of 1914, the man in nominal command of the operation was Helmut von Moltke the Younger, nephew of the famous Moltke, who had won the wars of German unification, and, by all surviving accounts, a man who understood the weight of that inheritance and was quietly terrified by it. Moltke had been modifying Schlieffen's concept for years before the war began. He had reinforced the left wing, the defensive hinge in Alsace, by drawing divisions away from the crucial right-wing sweep, the massive enveloping arm that was supposed to swing west of Paris and roll up the entire French army from behind. His reasoning was rational enough. France might attack in the east, and a catastrophic German defeat in Alsace would be politically devastating. But Schlieffen's concept, to whatever degree it was coherent as a unified plan, depended on the right wing being overwhelming. You don't weaken the arm that's supposed to do the strangling. The German mobilization of the summer of 1914 was, in scale, one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the pre-industrial to industrial transition. Roughly 1,500,000 men were directed to the Western Front alone. They moved by railway. Germany had been obsessively building and stress-testing its railway mobilization timetables since the wars of 1870, and the trains ran, for the most part, on schedule. What didn't run on schedule was the army once it got off the trains. Schlieffen's original concept required the German infantry on the right wing to march approximately 30 kilometers per day for nearly 40 consecutive days. Each division of roughly 17,000 men consumed, at rest, around 130 tons of supplies per day. On the march, under summer sun, that figure climbed sharply because horses need enormous quantities of fodder, and horses were still the principal engine of military logistics in 1914. The supply arithmetic was, not to put too fine a point on it, never seriously solved. It was assumed, and in war, assumption is the first casualty. Meanwhile, the French were executing their own plan, and their plan was failing in a different but equally catastrophic direction. France's Plan 17, a confident, aggressively offensive design conceived in the decade before the war, called for France to strike immediately into Alsace and Lorraine, the territories lost to Germany in 1871, and to force a decisive battle on French terms. It was a plan born of memory and emotion as much as strategy. It was also a plan that encountered German machine guns, artillery, and prepared defensive positions, and disintegrated in days. On the 22nd of August, 1914, a single day, a Tuesday, approximately 27,000 French soldiers were killed. In one day. That figure, which historians now consistently describe as the bloodiest single day in all of French military history, worse than any day at Verdun, worse than any day on the Somme, is almost entirely absent from popular memory of the First World War. You know about the 1st of July, 1916. You likely don't know about the 22nd of August, 1914. There's something slightly wrong with that. The British Expeditionary Force, meanwhile, had crossed the Channel and deployed into Belgium with a quiet, professional confidence that was not entirely unjustified. It was a small army, roughly 85,000 men and 290 guns. But it was the most thoroughly trained, the best equipped, and arguably the most technically proficient military force Britain had ever put into the field. On the 23rd of August, at a town in Belgium called Mons, these men met the German First Army along a 60-foot wide canal and held them, briefly, expensively, buying time that mattered. British casualties at Mons were approximately 1,600 men, concentrated heavily in specific battalions. The 4th Middlesex Regiment alone took over 400 casualties in a single afternoon. They then retreated, 80 miles south, in August heat, pursued by an enemy that didn't stop. The retreat from Mons lasted nearly 2 weeks, cost thousands more casualties, and by the time it ended, the BEF was a force that had been physically and psychologically wrung out, in a way that the polished pre-war regulars had not been trained to expect. Then came the Marne. In the first days of September 1914, the German advance, so confident, so thunderous just weeks before, stumbled. Kluck's First Army, which had been sweeping west of Paris as the plan required, turned east, toward the gap that had opened between the German armies. Why? The reasons remain debated, but the short version is this. German corps commanders were making independent decisions, communicating by motorcycle dispatch riders over roads that were never designed for an army's traffic, with no reliable telephone lines and no radio protocols worth the name. The orders that reached Kluck described a tactical situation that had already dissolved by the time they arrived. The Allied forces, including, famously, the 6,000 French reserve troops, ferried to the front in approximately 1,200 requisitioned Paris taxicabs, which is a story that is real, but strategically trivial, counterattacked. Germany's war plan expired on schedule. 40 days after mobilization, France was supposed to be defeated. It wasn't. The two sides dug in. What happened next is called the Race to the Sea, and the name is slightly misleading because nobody was racing toward the sea as a destination. Both sides were attempting to outflank each other's open northern flank, and the sea simply happened to be where that process ran out of room. Through October and into November of 1914, French, British, and German forces executed a series of lurching northward maneuvers along what was, in effect, an extending trench line. Each attempt to go around the other ended in a firefight, a stalemate, and more digging. By the time First Ypres ended in mid-November, the line stretched 440 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. And the original British Expeditionary Force, the one that had trained for years, that had served in South Africa and India, that carried the professional expertise of a long-service regular army, had, in Sir John French's own words to Lord Kitchener, been reduced to a shadow. Of the roughly 100,000 British regulars who crossed the Channel in August, approximately 58,000 were casualties by the end of First Ypres. The professional army of 1914 was gone. What replaced it was built from volunteers, eventually from conscripts, and it would be asked to fight a kind of war that nobody, not Schlieffen, not Moltke, not French, not the whole groaning edifice of European staff planning, had adequately imagined. The 40-mile timetable that Schlieffen's concept required had been missed by the narrowest of margins at the Marne, and then the front froze. That's the deceptively simple sentence at the heart of this entire story. The plan failed, the front froze, and 4 years of killing began. What I find genuinely troubling, though, and I've returned to this repeatedly, is the question of institutional honesty within the German command. Moltke's post-war memoir acknowledges that he modified Schlieffen's design. It does not fully reckon with what those modifications meant. The document that was supposed to prevent a two-front war had been quietly hollowed out before it was ever deployed, and nobody with the authority to stop the process said so clearly enough to matter. You can read the campaign of 1914 as a tragic operational failure, or you can read it as what happens when a military culture mistakes planning confidence for operational capability. Both readings are, I think, defensible. Only one of them is comfortable. The German army that went into Belgium in August of 1914 was a genuinely formidable institution. Its training was rigorous, its staff work meticulous by the standards of the age, its doctrine sophisticated. What it wasn't, what none of the major armies of 1914 were, was logistically prepared for the campaign that its own plans required. The supply lines stretched and snapped, the horses collapsed on roads they weren't built for, the dispatch riders couldn't outrun the collapse of the operational timetable, and the men at the tip of the advance, marching 30 kilometers a day under august heat, eating reduced rations because the supply wagons hadn't caught up, fighting skirmishes along the way, were, by the time the Marne was reached, simply exhausted human beings asking their bodies to do what the plan said they could. The plan didn't care about their bodies. Plans never do. There's a coda to the story of 1914 that tends to get lost in the rush toward the battles that followed. In the weeks after the front froze, as both sides settled into their improvised positions, and the soldiers began the hard, strange work of turning shell scrapes into something livable, the orders coming down from high command on both sides still described the current positions as temporary. Spring would bring the breakthrough. The war would be decided in the open. The trenches were an inconvenience, not a fate. The men digging them, mostly, believed this. They had no reason not to. The war was 5 months old, and everyone, the generals, the politicians, the newspapers, the soldiers themselves, was operating on the assumption that modern industrial nations simply could not sustain a great war for longer than a few months. The financial strain would be too great, the political pressure too intense, the human cost too visible. The assumption was wrong, and the men who would pay for that wrongness were, in the last weeks of 1914, pull their greatcoats tighter against the November rain of Flanders, and telling each other it would be over by Christmas. Engineering the cage. Here is the detail that I keep returning to, because I think it contains an entire argument about how the Western Front became what it became. The British Army's Field Engineering Manual of 1914, the official document governing how British soldiers were to construct defensive positions in the field, describes something called a hasty entrenchment, a hole one man can dig in approximately 45 minutes. 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, 18 inches deep. Enough to lie behind. Enough to break the silhouette of a standing man. That's the baseline. A 45-minute hole designed for one night's cover. Now hold that image while I tell you that by 1916, the same army was maintaining a trench system so complex, so layered, and so extensively mapped that the field survey companies of the Royal Engineers required 36 separate printing plates just to produce a single map sheet of the line in the 1 to 10,000 scale. What began as a 45-minute improvisation became, in roughly 2 years, a bureaucratic and physical structure of almost incomprehensible size. The question of how a temporary emergency measure becomes permanent infrastructure is a question about institutions and human psychology that doesn't only apply to the Western Front. But the Western Front answers it with unusual clarity. The winter of 1914 brought something both armies needed: time to think. The German army, which held the higher ground across most of the front, the slight ridges of Flanders, the chalk uplands of Picardy, began constructing what would become, over the next year and a half, the most elaborate defensive system in military history. German engineering doctrine in this period was unambiguous about permanence. Pioneer Regiment war diaries from Bavarian Army Corps units, dated as early as January of 1915, include requisition orders for steel I-beams to reinforce underground bunkers. Not timber, which was the improvisers' material, steel, which was the builders'. The Germans were ordering structural steel for their dugouts in January of 1915, barely 2 months after the front crystallized, while the British were still describing their positions in official documents as winter quarters. That asymmetry in intent, buried in the engineering requisition records, explains something significant about why the German defensive positions on the Western Front proved so much more resilient than the Allied ones. and why all those Allied bombardments designed to destroy German troops in their dugouts so consistently failed. The standard British frontline trench, as it was formally specified by the Royal Engineers in late 1914, was roughly 7 feet deep and approximately 3.5 feet wide at the bottom. Above the trench floor, at a height of about 2 feet, a fire step was cut into the forward wall, a ledge wide enough to stand on, which brought a rifleman's head to approximately parapet height. The parapet itself was faced with sandbags, not neatly stacked as they appear in museums, but rammed into whatever configuration would stay put in the specific soil of that specific sector. Behind the parapet, on the rearward side, there was a parados, a second bank of earth that protected against shell fragments landing from behind, and also prevented a soldier's silhouette from being seen against the sky. That's the basic anatomy. The devil, as always, was in the geology. In the chalk country of the Somme, men could dig down 10 feet and find stable, dry walls that held their shape. In the clay of Flanders, you hit water at 18 inches. In Flanders, you didn't dig down. You built up, constructing breastworks of sandbags above the original ground level, effectively building yourself a wall to crouch behind, rather than a hole to drop into. The engineering solution created a different kind of battlefield, flatter, more exposed, dependent on the height of the sandbag wall for cover, in a way that the chalk dugouts of the Somme were not. The wire is the element that gets the most attention in popular accounts of trench warfare, and rightly so, because it was probably the single most practically significant obstacle on the Western Front. But the way it's usually described, massive tangles of barbed wire stretching into the distance, slightly obscures how deliberate and precisely calibrated its deployment was by 1915. British General Staff notes from that period, compiled from after-action reports submitted by battalion commanders along the line, specify that wire entanglements in front of any given position should be laid to a minimum depth of 30 yards, in 3 interlocking belts, with the wire posts driven 18 inches into the soil, and the individual wire strands attached at heights that would catch a man's knees, his waist, and his chest simultaneously. Each 100 yards of defended frontage required approximately 3,000 yards of wire to create that entanglement properly. The British sector alone stretched roughly 80 miles. Work out the arithmetic. The numbers are staggering. And the wire had to be maintained. Raiding parties cut it at night, artillery churned it, rain rusted it, and repairing it meant going out into no man's land in the dark, which was its own particular category of controlled fear. No man's land itself was, in most sectors, somewhere between 50 and 250 yards wide. That doesn't sound like much. It sounds like a city street, or a cricket pitch, or a short sprint. But no man's land in practice was none of those things. It was churned earth, shell craters full of standing water, rusting wire, the remnants of previous attacks, and the specific quality of silence that exists when both sides know that any movement above ground level will attract fire. The German military engineering approach to this zone was, in some sectors, more sophisticated than the Allied approach. German defensive doctrine by 1915 was explicitly layered. A front line of outposts, a main resistance line set back far enough to survive artillery, and a second line further still. The idea was to absorb an attacking force into a defensive system that deepened rather than broke under pressure, to let attackers penetrate the outpost zone and then destroy them in the main resistance position, where German reserves could counterattack into enemy troops who were disorganized, far from their own lines, and running out of the specific kind of operational momentum that an assault requires. This concept, the elastic defense, was something the Allies spent the better part of 3 years learning to understand, and by the time they understood it, they had paid for the education in blood. The duckboard deserves its own moment. It's one of the unglamorous objects of the First World War. a flat wooden board, roughly a metre long and half a metre wide, made from whatever timber was available, laid across the floor of a trench or a communication sap to provide a surface above the standing water and mud that accumulated at the bottom of any trench that had been in use for more than a few weeks. Duckboards were first used systematically at Ploegsteert Wood in the Ypres sector in December of 1914, according to the Imperial War Museum's collection record for the standard British pattern. And from that point forward, they became as fundamental to trench life as the sandbag or the bayonet. Men rotated in and out of the line carrying duckboards. They were constantly being repaired, replaced, requisitioned, fought over between units. In the Flemish sectors, where the water table was never far below your boots, a broken or missing stretch of duckboard meant standing ankle deep in cold water for a week. Trench foot, the condition in which prolonged immersion in cold water damages the small blood vessels of the feet, causing swelling, pain, and eventually gangrene, affected hundreds of thousands of men over the course of the war. By 1915, British units were required to maintain records of trench foot cases as a measure of their sector's drainage management. A high trench foot rate was, in official terms, evidence of poor officer supervision. Men lost their feet. Their company commanders were formally blamed for insufficient attention to drainage. The communication trench was the circulatory system of this underground world. Running perpendicular to the front line, zigzagging every few yards to limit the blast corridor of any shell that landed in them, communication trenches connected the front line to the support line 200 yards behind it, and the support line to the reserve line several hundred yards further back, and from there to the regimental dump where food, ammunition, and materials arrived by carrying parties that moved only at night. The traverses, the regular zigzag turns built into all trench design, were not decorative. They were a physics problem, specifically the physics of blast and enfilading fire. A straight trench was a death trap. A machine gun positioned at one end could fire the length of it. An artillery shell landing in a straight trench sent its shrapnel in both directions simultaneously. The traverse, a 90-degree or steeper turn every 8 to 10 yards, broke the line of fire and limited the lethal zone of any single explosion to the few yards between turns. Men navigating communication trenches at night, bent under the weight of rations or ammunition boxes, felt these turns as an obstacle course. They were actually a life-saving architectural feature. Everything on the Western fronts was like this. What looked like inconvenience was usually engineering. The Germans understood something early that the British and French took longer to accept. Underground was where you survived. While Allied soldiers in many sectors still occupied relatively shallow dugouts cut into the walls of the trench, 6 feet deep, roofed with corrugated iron and a layer of sandbags, German engineering parties in the second half of 1915 were constructing dugouts 30 feet below the surface, reinforced with steel and concrete, equipped with electric light generated by small petrol engines, with bunks, with stoves, with regimental signs painted on the entrance posts. These weren't temporary shelters. They were, in every engineering sense of the word, permanent habitations. The British Army's initial response to this intelligence was a mixture of recognition and frustration. Recognition that the German approach was tactically sound. Frustration that British doctrine and planning continued for another year to assume that artillery bombardment would render these positions uninhabitable before infantry attacks. It did not. It could not. The shells that the BEF's artillery were firing at German dugout positions in 1915 and 1916 were, in many cases, simply not heavy enough to penetrate 30 feet of chalk and steel. The men going over the top after the barrage lifted were walking into positions that the bombardment had announced was coming, had failed to destroy, and had left fully manned by soldiers who had been underground, waiting for the guns to stop. By the end of 1914, the trench system had approximately 440 miles of frontline trench, roughly 440 miles of support trench, and a further labyrinth of communication trenches, artillery positions, reserve lines, and supply routes that extended miles to the rear of the fighting positions. When I try to calculate the total linear footage of excavation across the entire Western Front at its peak development in 1916, the figures become genuinely difficult to comprehend. An estimated 1,200 miles of fully developed trench positions on the British sector alone, when all lines and laterals are included. Add the French and German sectors, and the number climbs towards several thousand miles of open excavation cut into the soil of northern France and Belgium. The earth moved to create this system. The specific cubic footage of chalk, clay, and loam pulled out of the ground by men with picks and shovels, working by night under fire, represents one of the largest human engineering undertakings in history, built in conditions of continuous physical danger and built, in the first months, by men who were told they wouldn't need it for long. There's a detail in the Imperial War Museum's duckboard collection record that I find quietly arresting. The catalogue entry notes that duckboards were first introduced at Ploegsteert Wood in December of 1914. That's a specific date. It means that someone, in a specific wet corner of Belgium, at a specific moment in the war's first winter, looked at the standing water in the bottom of a trench and went and got some boards and laid them down. No order from GHQ, no doctrine. A soldier solving the immediate problem in front of him with the materials closest to hand. And what that man started, that specific improvised response to a wet floor, became a logistical line item that the British Army maintained for the next 4 years, consuming hundreds of thousands of board feet of imported timber per month. The Western Front is full of these moments. A specific soldier, a specific problem, a specific practical solution that calcified into permanent requirement. The war was built from improvisations that nobody ever officially decided to make permanent. They just became permanent anyway, because the war kept going, and nobody had a plan for stopping it. The Accountants of Death. In May of 1915, a British journalist named Charles Reppington published a dispatch in the Times of London. The headline read, "Need for shells. British attacks checked. Limited supply the cause." It was not, in any conventional sense, a news story. It was a carefully arranged political weapon, fired with the assistance of Sir John French, the BEF's commander-in-chief, who was furious at Lord Kitchener's management of shell supply and had decided to use the press to apply the kind of pressure that proper military channels had failed to generate. The story caused a political crisis within 48 hours. Asquith's Liberal government was shaken badly enough that within weeks a coalition cabinet was formed, the first since the Napoleonic Wars, and by June, David Lloyd George had been installed as the first Minister of Munitions in British history, presiding over a new government department whose sole purpose was to turn the British economy into a machine for producing artillery shells. All of that political cascade from one journalist's dispatch. But here's the detail that the dispatch didn't mention, and that Lloyd George's private correspondence makes clear. The shell shortage wasn't primarily a supply problem. It was a specification problem. 3,000 engineering firms across Britain were sitting idle, fully capable of manufacturing shell casings to tolerances that the army required. And the ministry hadn't certified them because the established Sheffield armaments manufacturers had convinced the procurement bureaucracy that only they could do it properly. The shells weren't being made because the contracts weren't being issued. It was, at bottom, a monopoly problem dressed up in military language. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle in March of 1915 was the event that made the shell shortage politically visible. It was the BEF's first major set-piece offensive of the war. A deliberate, carefully planned attack against a German salient in the Artois region, preceded by 35 minutes of artillery preparation that was, at that point, the most concentrated British bombardment ever attempted. The attack initially succeeded, which surprised almost everyone, including some of the attacking officers. But by the third day, the momentum had collapsed. Not because German reinforcements had overwhelming numbers, but because the BEF had run out of shells to suppress the roads and communications that those reinforcements were using. British casualties: approximately 11,650 over 3 days. Ground gained: roughly 1,200 yards. The after-action report noted that the artillery had been rationed to approximately 3 rounds per gun per day during the critical exploitation phase. 3 shells per gun per day in an offensive against prepared positions. The mathematics of that situation don't require commentary. Lloyd George moved into the Ministry of Munitions with the same energy that he brought to every institutional problem. Aggressive, politically astute, and utterly convinced that the generals were idiots who needed civilian management to get anything done. That last conviction was not entirely wrong, though it wasn't entirely right either. His first significant act was to abolish the Sheffield monopoly on shell production. His second was to begin accrediting the 2,000-plus engineering firms that had been waiting for certification. By October of 1915, the monthly shell output for the BEF had begun climbing sharply. By the end of 1916, it had reached over 2.5 million shells per month, a figure that would have seemed entirely fantastical to the quartermaster who was rationing 3 rounds per gun per day at Neuve-Chapelle. The official history of the Ministry of Munitions, published in 1922, attributes this expansion to the systematic restructuring of procurement that Lloyd George initiated. Lloyd George's own memoirs attribute it almost entirely to Lloyd George. The ministry's internal records tell a slightly different story. The detailed production expansion program had been drafted by a civil servant named Eric Geddes, who had previously managed a section of the North Eastern Railway, some 6 weeks before Lloyd George took office. Geddes's fingerprints are all over the practical architecture of British munitions expansion. Lloyd George was the political engine that made implementation possible. The credit, as is common in these situations, settled on the politician. The women who actually built the shells have a different story, and it's one that the official histories consistently underweight. By 1918, approximately 950,000 women were employed in direct munitions production across Britain, filling the shells, machining the casings, pressing the propellant, testing the fuses. They were called munitionettes, a word that managed to be simultaneously patronizing and affectionate, which tells you something about the social position these women occupied. The most dangerous work was shell filling, packing the cavity of the casing with lyddite or TNT, or one of the other high explosives that British ordnance used in different proportions for different shell types. Lyddite, picric acid, was relatively stable. TNT was more sensitive and significantly more toxic. Women who worked in TNT filling facilities absorbed the compound through skin contact and inhalation, and trinitrotoluene at chronic low-level exposure causes toxic jaundice, liver damage, kidney impairment, and the distinctive yellowing of skin that gave these women their nickname, Canary Girls. In 1916, approximately 400 deaths were recorded directly attributable to TNT toxicity across British munitions facilities, a figure that the ministry classified and did not publicise. On the 5th of December 1916, an explosion at the Barnbow shell filling factory in Leeds killed 35 women in a single event. The ministry's internal casualty register described them, in the administrative language of production management, as production losses. That phrase is in the historical record. I'm not embellishing it. The fuse problem is a detail that I don't think gets enough attention in accounts of the shell crisis, because it connects the industrial failure to the tactical failure on the battlefield in a very specific and traceable way. The standard fuse fitted to British 18-pounder shells required manufacturing tolerances of plus or minus 0.003 of an inch to function reliably. That's a precision requirement of the kind that Sheffield armaments firms, with their trained craftsmen, their calibrated machinery, their generations of metalworking expertise, could consistently achieve. The firms that were newly accredited under Lloyd George's expansion program, the bicycle manufacturers, the textile machinery makers, the small engineering workshops of Lancashire and Birmingham, were working to get there, and many of them did get there eventually. But in the transition period of 1915 and into 1916, the dud rate in British shells was significant. Estimates from British Ordnance surveys put the proportion of defective fuses at between 15 and 25% of new production in the expansion phase. 1 in 4 shells, potentially, that didn't go off when it should. 1 in 4 shells in the wire-cutting barrage before the Somme that bounced off the ground or buried itself in chalk and simply sat there while German machine guns waited behind intact wire. The men who went forward on the 1st of July, 1916, didn't know this. The generals planning the attack had the dud rate data. They proceeded anyway. There's a figure I want to put in front of you and simply let sit for a moment. Between the 24th of June and the 1st of July, 1916, 7 days before the Somme attack began, the British Expeditionary Force fired approximately 1,508,652 artillery shells along the 20-mile front. 1.5 million shells in 7 days. The physical weight of that metal and explosive was, by calculation, somewhere in the region of 108,000 tons. The cost, in 1916 sterling, was roughly £7 million per day, or, in 2026 values, somewhere in the range of £550 million per day. That is what the British Empire was spending, per day, to announce to the German army precisely where it intended to attack, and precisely when. The German Second Army occupied its dugouts, went underground, and waited. When the barrage lifted on the 1st of July, they emerged, climbed to their fire steps, and were ready. The 108,000 tons of delivered ordnance had not, in the critical northern sectors, destroyed the wire. It had not destroyed the deep dugouts. And the men walking toward those positions had been told, with genuine institutional confidence, that it had done both. The 18-pounder shell deserves a moment of technical attention, because understanding it helps explain why the industrial mobilization was simultaneously impressive and insufficient. The standard British field artillery projectile was 3.3 inches in diameter, 11.3 inches in length, weighing 18.5 pounds complete. Inside it, 1.7 pounds of lyddite bursting charge, 1.7 pounds. In a shell that weighed over 18 pounds, the explosive content was less than 10% of total weight. The rest was the steel body, designed to fragment when the charge detonated and throw those fragments at lethal velocity across a cone of destruction, extending roughly 40 yards in front of the burst. This fragmentation shell was an excellent weapon against men in the open. It was much less effective against men in dugouts 30 feet underground. To destroy a reinforced German bunker of the kind constructed in the Somme sector, you needed a heavy howitzer, a 233mm or a 305mm weapon. Firing a shell whose explosive content was not 1.7 pounds, but 60, 80, 100 pounds. Delivered on a high trajectory that would plunge into the ground rather than skim across it. The BEF in 1916 had approximately 1 heavy artillery piece per 14 meters of front in the Somme sector. The German dugout depth standard was 30 feet. The physics of this situation were not ambiguous. What Lloyd George understood, and what makes the Ministry of Munitions a genuinely important institution, not just a political story, is that the shell crisis of 1915 revealed something that peacetime military thinking had consistently failed to grasp. Industrial war isn't decided on the battlefield. It's decided in the factory, in the procurement office, in the negotiation between the government official and the engineering firm manager, who hasn't yet been certified to make shells, but has a factory floor full of idle machinery and a workforce that needs paying. The Western Front consumed material at rates that no European nation had planned for, and the nation that could most efficiently convert its economy to war production would, over time, gain an advantage that battlefield tactics alone couldn't generate or erase. Britain took most of 1915 to learn this. Germany was learning it simultaneously, facing the additional pressure of the Royal Navy's blockade, cutting off imported raw materials. By 1916, the Western Front was already, whatever the generals thought about grand strategy, primarily a competition between two industrial economies being dismantled to feed two artillery programs. The munitions expansion had a political consequence that nobody in June of 1915 was fully predicting, though in retrospect it seems almost inevitable. The need to mobilize 950,000 women for industrial production created a labor force that had never been in that labor force before, working jobs that had never been defined as women's jobs before, producing results that were measurable and undeniable. That workforce would not simply disappear at the end of the war, or rather, it would disappear from those jobs because it would be pushed out of them, formally and deliberately, by a return to pre-war labor arrangements. But the political claim that women had made on public life, by virtue of what they had built and what they had died doing, could not be unmade. The shell crisis of 1915 planted a political seed that the Representation of the People Act of 1918 partially harvested. Only partially, only for women over 30. But the connection between the factory floor and the ballot paper runs directly through the Ministry of Munitions, and through the 35 women at Barnbo, who the ministry called production losses. The official history of the Ministry of Munitions runs to 12 volumes. 12 volumes. It's an extraordinary document, dense with production tables, procurement debates, labor statistics, factory expansion schedules, and it's almost entirely unread outside specialist circles. I've spent time with parts of it, and what strikes me most is how bloodless it is. Not in the sense of being emotionally cold, though it is that. Bloodless in the sense that the word shell in these documents refers to an industrial product with a unit cost and a production schedule and a delivery timeline, and the connection between that industrial product and the human beings at the other end of its trajectory is simply not the document's concern. The Ministry of Munitions was responsible for producing the ordnance that killed more men on the Western Front than any other single cause. It is documented in 12 meticulous volumes as a triumph of industrial management. Both of those things are simultaneously true, and there's something about that simultaneity that I think the Western Front forces you to sit with, uncomfortably, for a while. Poison on the wind. There are two facts about Fritz Haber that, taken individually, would place him in completely different histories. The first, he developed, together with the chemist Carl Bosch and the industrial resources of BASF, the process by which atmospheric nitrogen can be fixed into ammonia through high temperature and pressure catalysis. A process that, by enabling the mass manufacture of artificial fertilizer, is now estimated to sustain the nutritional needs of somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion people globally. Half of humanity, or close to it, eating because of this man's chemistry. The second fact, in April of 1915, he personally supervised the release of 168 tons of compressed chlorine gas from 5,730 steel cylinders along a 6-kilometre stretch of the Western Front near the Belgian town of Langemarck. It is one of history's more uncomfortable biographical juxtapositions. The man who helped feed the world also built the architecture of chemical warfare. His wife Clara, also a chemist, also formidably intelligent, living in the specific early 20th century constraints of a gifted woman whose professional life was perpetually subordinated to her husband's, shot herself in their garden on the night he returned from Ypres. Their son found her. Fritz Haber left for the Eastern Front the following morning to supervise further deployments. In a letter recovered and authenticated decades later, Clara had written that what her husband was doing in the war was, in her precise phrasing, a perversion of science. Not evil, a perversion. A scientific category, not a moral one. She was a chemist to the end. The 22nd of April, 1915, fell on a Thursday. The afternoon was clear, with a gentle northeast wind moving at approximately 2 to 3 meters per second. The meteorological conditions that Haber's team had been waiting days to achieve, because the gas had to move toward the enemy, rather than back along the German lines, and the wind speed had to be sufficient to carry the cloud, but not so strong as to disperse it before it could achieve lethal concentration. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Pioneer Regiment 35 opened the cylinder valves along the German front. A yellow-green cloud approximately 500 meters wide, roughly a meter in height at the release line, began drifting toward the French and Algerian colonial positions on the northern flank of the Ypres salient. The physiological effect of chlorine gas at the concentrations achieved that afternoon is clinically described as pulmonary edema. The lungs fill with fluid. The sensation is drowning. Men who survived describe seeing the cloud and not understanding what it was, and then the smell, a sharp, bleach-like odor, and then the inability to breathe, the sensation of drowning while standing upright in open air. The French, Algerian, and colonial units on the left of the Canadian line broke and ran, leaving a gap in the front of approximately 4 miles. The Canadian 1st Division, on the Algerians' right, held. They held by lying face down in the mud or pressing wet handkerchiefs to their faces. The improvised first response to a weapon for which no formal countermeasure existed, and refusing, through some combination of discipline, stubbornness, and the specific calculus of men who had nowhere to run, to leave. Haber's operational report to the German Supreme Command, filed 4 days after the attack, is a document I find difficult to read, not because it is graphic. It is, if anything, the opposite of graphic, but because it is so entirely absorbed in the technical. Wind speed, gas concentration at release, estimated effective penetration depth, observed tactical outcome. It reads like a laboratory notebook recording a successful experiment. Nowhere in 4 pages of analysis is a human being mentioned. Somewhere between the 5th and 8th kilometer of effective penetration, depending on atmospheric stability, were men whose lungs were filling with fluid. The report describes observed disruption of Allied forward positions and significant reduction in defensive capacity along the affected sector. It does not use the word drowning. It uses the word disruption. I don't know precisely where the line is between professional distance and moral self-insulation. But whatever that line is, I think Haber's report is on the wrong side of it. Chlorine was, as chemical weapons go, relatively manageable, once you understood what it was. It was yellow-green and visible. It smelled distinctly of bleach or swimming pools. It irritated the eyes and throat immediately, giving some warning. By June of 1915, the first rudimentary countermeasures were in place along the British sector. Cotton pads soaked in sodium bicarbonate solution, issued by the hundreds of thousands. The pads were held over the mouth by hand. You needed both hands to hold them, while trying to remain combat effective. Within 3 weeks of the first Ypres attack, over 300,000 improvised pads had been distributed. By 1916, the small box respirator, an activated charcoal filter canister derived from mining industry respiratory protection, connected to a rubber facepiece, was in service across the BEF. The development cycle from improvised bicarbonate rag to effective protection technology, approximately 14 months. That's not a negligent response. Given that nobody on the Allied side had been preparing for chemical warfare before April of 1915, it's a relatively efficient one. 14 months to go from zero doctrine to a workable respirator, while simultaneously fighting a war on a 440-mile front. The institutional machinery was capable of learning. It was just that the learning happened in arrears, with a casualty list as the tuition payment. Germany introduced phosgene, carbonyl chloride, in December of 1915, and the switch from chlorine represented a significant escalation in lethality that the Allied countermeasure cycle hadn't anticipated. Phosgene is colourless. It smells faintly of freshly cut hay or green corn. Not alarming, not instinctively recognisable as a weapon. At concentrations above approximately 25 parts per million, initial exposure produces only mild chest discomfort. A soldier exposed to phosgene in the field might feel briefly unwell, appear to recover, and be sent back to his unit, or simply continue in the line. What was happening inside his lungs during that symptom-free period, which could last 24 to 48 hours, was a progressive chemical reaction between the gas molecules and the protein structures of the alveolar membranes. The membranes were breaking down. Fluid was beginning to accumulate in the air sacs where oxygen transfer happens. The soldier was drowning in slow motion. Death, when it came, arrived from oxygen starvation 1 to 3 days after exposure, and in many cases was not recognized as gas poisoning by the medical staff, treating what appeared to be a respiratory illness of unclear origin. This delayed mechanism is what made phosgene so militarily effective. It was responsible for approximately 80 to 85% of all chemical warfare fatalities in the First World War. It was quiet, it was invisible, and it didn't kill you right away, which meant you didn't always know you'd been killed. Mustard gas arrived in July of 1917, and it changed the calculus of chemical warfare again, fundamentally. Dichlorodiethyl sulfide, sulfur mustard, didn't behave like chlorine or phosgene. It wasn't primarily an agent that killed by pulmonary damage, though it could do that in sufficient concentration. Mustard was an area denial and incapacitation weapon. It seeped into clothing. It blistered skin on contact. Large, fluid-filled blisters covering the arms, legs, and torso of men who walked through a gassed area hours after the gas had settled. It attacked the eyes, causing temporary blindness that could last weeks. It settled into the soil and remained active for days after release, turning any occupied position into a contaminated zone from which movement, eating, drinking, performing any basic function, carried the risk of absorption through the skin. And here was the military calculation that made mustard genuinely strategically significant. A soldier killed outright was, from a cold arithmetic perspective, a casualty of 1. A soldier incapacitated by mustard blisters and temporarily blinded, who required nursing care for 6 to 8 weeks, was, from an industrial war resource perspective, a far more expensive casualty. He consumed medical labor, hospital beds, transport, and treatment resources for the duration of his recovery. By the armistice, chemical shells constituted roughly 25% of British and French ammunition production and approximately 35% of German. That's a quarter of all shells being fired for their chemical content, not their explosive content. The chemistry had entered the industrial calculus of the war as a permanent variable. I want to be precise about the scale of chemical warfare casualties, because the numbers are often presented in ways that either overstate or understate their significance. Over the entire war, across all fronts, approximately 1.3 million chemical warfare casualties were recorded, of which roughly 90,000 died. That sounds enormous, but in the context of a war that generated something in the range of 15 to 20 million military deaths overall, 90,000 chemical deaths is statistically a small fraction, less than 1%. The impact of chemical weapons on the Western Front was not primarily measured in bodies. It was measured in psychological damage, in the institutional terror that gas alarms produced, in the operational constraints imposed by contaminated ground, in the medical resource burden of the incapacitated rather than the dead. In the specific sectors of the Ypres salient, where mustard gas was deployed most heavily from mid-1917, ground that had been gassed was genuinely denied to infantry movement for days afterward. That denial of ground had tactical implications that the casualty statistics don't capture. The response from the Allied medical establishment to chemical warfare was, by the standards of the time, reasonably systematic. Chemical casualty wards were established, classification protocols developed, the distinct physiological profiles of different gas agents documented with increasing precision. The problem was that the documentation was perpetually one step behind the German chemical program. When chlorine appeared in April of 1915, the Allied medical understanding of industrial gas poisoning was drawn from mining accident literature. When phosgene appeared in December of 1915, the existing protocols were designed for chlorine and provided inadequate guidance for the delayed presentation phosgene case. When mustard appeared in July of 1917, the medical system had protocols for respiratory gas agents and essentially nothing for a vesicant, a skin-blistering agent, at industrial scale. Each new German chemical weapon exposed the gap between existing knowledge and required knowledge, and men paid for that gap with their health or their lives, while the knowledge was being acquired. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry for 1918 was awarded to Fritz Haber. The committee's deliberations are a matter of historical record, and they show that the chemical warfare program was discussed and explicitly determined not to disqualify his candidacy for the ammonia synthesis work. The prize was for what Haber had given to agriculture, to the feeding of the world, to the metabolic infrastructure of industrial civilization. The gas clouds at Ypres and the hundreds of chemical weapons deployments that followed were weighed, in that committee room, against the nitrogen fixation that fed billions, and the committee concluded the scales still tipped toward the prize. I don't know how to adjudicate that decision. I'm not sure it can be adjudicated. What I do know is that Clara Haber used the word perversion specifically. Not evil, not criminal, perversion. The corruption of a discipline. The use of chemistry, which she understood as a method of understanding the natural world and improving human life, in the service of the calculated destruction of human bodies. She was a scientist describing a scientific failure, and she was right. The chemical weapons of the First World War produced one lasting legal achievement, the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which prohibited the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases and of bacteriological methods of warfare. It was ratified by most major powers within a decade. It is the direct ancestor of the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, now ratified by 193 states. The specific machinery of international law that makes the use of chemical weapons today a violation of the rules of war, the specific treaty language, the specific prohibitions, the specific inspection protocols, traces back in a direct line to the yellow-green cloud that drifted across the Allied lines at Langemarck on the 22nd of April, 1915, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It is one of the more bitter forms of moral progress, the atrocity that generates the rule against itself. Verdun, the mincing machine as policy. There is a document, or there may be a document, at the center of the Battle of Verdun. Its existence, its authenticity, and its meaning have been argued over by historians for decades, and the argument has never been cleanly resolved. And that irresolution is, itself, the most important thing about it. The document is known as the Christmas Memorandum, It was supposedly written by General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff, in December of 1914, and addressed to the Kaiser. In it, Falkenhayn supposedly proposed attacking the French fortress complex at Verdun, not to capture it, but to force France into defending it, at whatever cost, until France ran out of men. The famous phrase associated with this document, though it doesn't appear in quite those words in any authenticated text, is "bleed France white." It would make Verdun not a battle with a territorial objective, but a battle with a human objective: the deliberate, calculated destruction of French military manpower as a strategic end in itself. It would make the mincing machine the point, not a side effect. The German historian Holger Afflerbach, working in the archives in the 1990s, argued that the Christmas memorandum is almost certainly a post hoc fabrication, that Falkenhayn wrote it, or at minimum substantially revised it, after Verdun had failed and after he had been dismissed, to present a strategic defeat as a calculated strategy. If Afflerbach is correct, the most famous example of attrition as conscious military policy in the entire 20th century is, at least partly, the self-exculpatory fiction of a fired general. The possibility that this is true has not diminished the document's influence on military theory. Attrition doctrine in every major military staffed in the last century has been partly built on this specific piece of possible revisionism. What is not in dispute is what happened on the morning of the 21st of February, 1916, in the hills north of the French city of Verdun. At 12 minutes past 7 in the morning, the German artillery opened fire along an 8-mile front. What it fired in the following 9 hours, approximately 2 million shells, representing the largest single artillery bombardment in history up to that point, is a number that the mind doesn't quite absorb on first encounter. 2 million in 9 hours. That is roughly 2,200 shells per minute, continuously, for 9 hours. The French 72nd Division's sector went silent at 18 minutes past 7. All telephone communication destroyed, every messenger route cut, every signal relay eliminated by the same bombardment that was simultaneously turning the physical landscape into a lunar surface. The French High Command's first confirmed notification that an attack was underway came from the sound of the guns, audible 100 miles south in the city of Chalon. Not from a telephone call, not from a dispatch rider, from sound, arriving 100 miles away at the speed of sound. The fortress of Douaumont fell on the 24th of February, and its fall was almost farcical in its specifics. Farcical in the way that genuinely terrible events sometimes are, when the gap between the symbol and the reality becomes so wide it tips into the absurd. Douaumont was France's most powerful fortress. It had an armoured cupola, a concrete shell 3 meters thick in places, an elaborate system of underground galleries and magazines. The French had decided, sometime in 1915, that permanent fortifications were a liability in artillery warfare rather than an asset, and had quietly reduced its garrison. By February of 1916, the fort was held by a small maintenance detachment. A German patrol from the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, not a specially organized assault force, just a patrol moving forward during the general advance, found the fort apparently undefended, found an unlocked entry point in the outer works, and walked in. The most symbolically significant fortress in France, worth more in psychological terms to French national identity than any 20 square miles of open ground, was captured by a patrol that was, by reasonable inference from the regimental diary's language, not entirely certain what it had just found. The official German account presented it as a deliberate storm. The regimental diary's tone is rather more tentative. The French response to Verdun was built around a concept that their commander, General Philippe Pétain, appointed on the 25th of February, in the crisis of the attack's second day, called the Noria. The word means water wheel in French, and the image is precise. A rotating system that brings water up from a well and turns it continuously. Pétain's Noria rotated the entire French army through Verdun in sequence, cycling each division in, keeping it for the period its cohesion could survive, rotating it out before it broke. By the battle's end, 70 of France's 95 frontline divisions had served at Verdun. The single road that supplied the French position, the D1012 between Bar-le-Duc and Verdun, 75 kilometers of agricultural road that became known as the Voie Sacrée, moved approximately 6,000 vehicles per day at peak operation. One truck every 14 seconds, 24 hours a day, through summer heat and winter mud, resurfaced continuously by gangs of 8,500 labourers who worked by night because working by day meant being shelled. Pétain's quartermaster, Major Richard, divided the road into 6 administrative sectors with dedicated repair parties in each, and issued a standing order that no vehicle was permitted to stop on the road surface. A breakdown meant the vehicle was immediately pushed to the verge. The road was more important than any individual truck. That is the principle of the Voie Sacrée. The system overrides the object. Very cold, very practical, and, over 302 days, the thing that kept France in the battle. Fort Vaux, in June of 1916, was where the human cost of Verdun compressed itself most completely into a single location. The garrison under Commandant Sylvain Eugène Raynal held out for 5 days against German assault, fighting through the fort's own corridors in conditions of total darkness, using rifles, flamethrowers, and in the final hours, bare hands. The fort had no water. Raynal released carrier pigeons requesting relief on the 3rd of June, the 4th of June. His last bird, one that historians have since named Vaillant, though the pigeon's fate is the documented detail, arrived at the loft at Verdun with both wings damaged by gas, but having completed the flight. The pigeon was subsequently awarded the Légion d'honneur, which is a real fact and not a metaphor. The relief Raynal had requested never came. On the 7th of June he surrendered, and the German commander, recognizing what he had defeated, provided the garrison with food and water, and sent a report to the Kaiser, noting their exceptional conduct. The Kaiser awarded Raynal the Pour le Mérite, a German decoration awarded to an enemy prisoner of war, which is also a real fact. The relief that might have saved the fort and its garrison existed in the French sector records as received and acted upon. The fort fell anyway. Both of those things are in the documents. By the summer of 1916, the Verdun sector had been under continuous heavy bombardment for 5 months. The specific sensory environment that resulted is documented in medical officers' reports from both sides, in a way that the official tactical records don't record, because official tactical records don't have a category for smell. The ground for miles around Verdun had been so thoroughly churned by shellfire, the entire topsoil and subsoil repeatedly turned over, mixed, and relaid, that decomposing human remains had been incorporated into the soil itself. Soldiers described the smell as sweet, heavy, reminiscent of rotting fruit. German medical officers' reports documented nausea affecting combat performance, not as a psychological reaction, but as a physiological one, a chronic, low-level toxic exposure that degraded alertness and stamina over periods of weeks. This was documented as an operational variable. The medical system had a category for it. It appears in German Corps medical reports as a factor bearing on unit combat efficiency ratings. Men were being degraded, not by wounds or by fear, but by the smell of the ground they were standing on. The battle ended on the 18th of December, 1916. 302 days. French casualties, approximately 377,000, killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties, approximately 337,000. The front line on the 18th of December ran within 2 kilometers of where it had stood on the 20th of February. Between 40 and 60 million shells had been fired by both sides over the course of the battle. The French had recovered Fort Douaumont by October. The Germans had abandoned it in the face of a French counter-offensive that discovered, among other things, that the psychological value of its recapture was enormous, and the tactical necessity of holding it, at that stage of the war, was limited. Falkenhayn had been dismissed as chief of the German General Staff in August of 1916, before the battle was over, replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who represented an entirely different strategic conception of how the war should be fought. He was sent to command in Romania. He wrote his memoir later, in which the Christmas memorandum justifying Verdun appeared. Whether the memorandum was written in December of 1914, as he claimed, or composed in retrospect after his dismissal to defend his historical reputation, the German military archives do not allow a definitive conclusion. Historians argue about it still. In the specific killing ground around the Verdun battlefield, the Zone Rouge, the permanent exclusion zone established after the war, the land remains, to this day, legally designated as uninhabitable. Approximately 100 square kilometers of it. The soil contains an estimated 10 to 12 million unexploded shells, along with arsenic concentrations measured in some survey areas at 3,000 times the French legal agricultural standard. The bones of soldiers, French and German, who were never recovered, are still in that ground. Farmers in the surrounding region are the mind breaks. There is a document at St. John's College, Cambridge, that belongs to a category of primary source that military history doesn't quite know what to do with. It's a set of clinical case notes made by a Cambridge neurologist named William Holse Rivers, known to colleagues simply as Rivers, who was posted to Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh in 1917 to treat officers suffering from what the army was calling shell shock. The case notes are not dramatic. They don't read like fiction. They read like a careful man trying to do a precise thing with tools that aren't quite the right shape for the job. Rivers was, before the war, an anthropologist as well as a neurologist. He'd spent years studying the Torres Strait Islanders, documenting kinship systems, measuring psychological responses across cultures. He brought to Craig Lockhart the habits of an observer who was trained to notice what other people's frameworks made invisible. What he noticed at Craig Lockhart was this. The army had given him a hospital full of men who were broken in ways the army didn't have adequate language for. And the language it did have, shell shock, neurasthenia, cowardice, each carried a different legal consequence for the man it was attached to. Rivers wasn't just a doctor at Craig Lockhart. He was a man who had to decide for each patient which word applied. And the word he chose could send that man back to the front, to a rest facility, or, in the worst cases, for the worst words, to a court-martial. The term shell shock itself was coined by a British medical officer named Charles Myers, who published his observations in the medical journal The Lancet in February of 1915, describing soldiers whose neurological symptoms, paralysis, blindness, deafness, uncontrolled tremors, appeared to have no physical cause. Myers's initial hypothesis was that the concussive pressure of nearby shell explosions was causing microscopic physical damage to brain tissue. He was wrong about the mechanism. He was right that something real was happening. The Army's response to his paper was, characteristically, administrative. It needed categories. By 1916, the medical system had formalized a split between organic shell shock, produced by a physical event, therefore respectable, therefore treatable as injury, and functional shell shock, produced by emotional weakness, therefore suspect, therefore potentially equivalent to cowardice. Officers tended to receive neurasthenia, which was the classier diagnosis, carrying Oxford overtones of civilized sensitivity under pressure. Private soldiers received a stamp, NYDN, meaning not yet diagnosed, nervous, which offered fewer protections, faster return to unit processing, and considerably less benefit of the doubt. The system was not designed to be cruel. It produced cruelty anyway, through the straightforward mechanism of applying different institutional responses to the same condition depending on the rank of the person experiencing it. By December of 1914, before the first full winter of the war had ended, British medical reports estimated that somewhere between 7 and 10% of all officers and 3 to 4% of other ranks in the BEF were registered as nervous and mental shock cases. Those percentages, applied to the forces in the field, represent tens of thousands of men. And the war was 4 months old. The Somme hadn't happened yet. Passchendaele hadn't happened yet. The men arriving at facilities like Craig Lockhart in 1917 were men who had been through things for which the human nervous system was not designed. And the institution responsible for their welfare was simultaneously their employer, their court, and their jailer. Rivers understood this contradiction. His case notes show a man circling the same problem from different angles. How do you help someone whose recovery means returning them to the conditions that broke them? Siegfried Sassoon arrived at Craig Lockhart in July of 1917, and his case was, to put it plainly, a political embarrassment for the War Office. Sassoon was a decorated infantry officer with the Military Cross, a man who had charged German trenches alone and been called Mad Jack by his own regiment in terms that were admiring rather than clinical. He wasn't sent to Craig Lockhart because he was shell-shocked. He was sent because he had published a formal written statement refusing to return to the front, describing the war as being deliberately prolonged by politicians who could end it but wouldn't. And he had somehow arranged for this statement to be read in the House of Commons. The War Office's options were limited. Court-martial a decorated hero, which would produce a trial and publicity they didn't want, or classify his protest as a symptom of mental illness and ship him quietly to Edinburgh for treatment. They chose Edinburgh. Rivers treated him. Sassoon's own account, in the thinly fictionalized memoir Schurston's Progress, describes their conversations as genuine, a mutual exploration between two intelligent men of the war's meaning and the obligations of conscience. Rivers's conclusion, after months of sessions, was that Sassoon was sane, was not shell-shocked, and should return to active service. Sassoon accepted the recommendation and went back. Wilfred Owen, who was at Craig Lockhart at the same time, being treated for shell shock that was not in any sense disputed, was killed on the 4th of November, 1918, 7 days before the armistice. His mother received the telegram on the 11th of November, while Shrewsbury church bells rang for the peace. The 306 British and Commonwealth soldiers executed for cowardice or desertion during the war represent the darkest intersection of the shell shock question and the Army's institutional logic. 306 men, shot at dawn, having been through court-martial processes that in many cases lasted under an hour, and in which the relevant medical evidence was either absent, dismissed, or not sought. Post-war medical research has concluded with reasonable confidence that a significant number of these men were displaying symptoms consistent with what we would now diagnose as acute stress disorder or severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The British government granted posthumous pardons to all 306 in August of 2006, in legislation moved by the Defence Secretary. The pardons did not formally declare the executions wrong. The precise language was more careful than that. But the parliamentary debate made the government's view clear enough. A military historian named Gary Sheffield argued at the time, and has argued since, that the executions served a necessary disciplinary function, and that applying 21st century diagnostic frameworks to 1915 courts-martial is a form of anachronism. He has a point in a narrow technical sense. The men who authorized these executions were operating within the legal and medical frameworks of their time. The question is what those frameworks reveal about the institution that built them, and what that institution was willing to do to maintain its operational coherence. The term shell shock was officially banned by the British Army in 1917, not because the condition wasn't real, because the term was considered bad for morale and was encouraging men to present with psychological symptoms. A War Office circular directed that the phrase not appear in any medical record. The soldiers didn't stop breaking, they just stopped being officially described as broken. I find this, when I sit with it, genuinely chilling. Not as a dramatic discovery, but as a very ordinary piece of institutional management. Someone sat in an office and decided that the right response to an epidemic of psychological collapse was to prohibit the vocabulary for describing it, and filed the circular, and it was distributed. And on the Western Front, men who could no longer function carried diagnoses that didn't say why. By the war's end, approximately 80,000 British soldiers had been formally treated for war neuroses. An estimated 200,000 more showed symptoms, but were never formally diagnosed. The pension claims related to nervous disease, filed by British veterans in the decade after the armistice, was still outstanding in 1939, when the next war began. A generation of men carrying the invisible residue of the Western Front walked into the Great Depression, many of them unable to hold employment, some unable to hold a conversation. And the institution that had made and managed their experience had formally declared, by the time they got home, that the specific word for what was wrong with them was not to be used. Rivers, to his credit, kept working. He died in 1922, at 58, still trying to build a framework for understanding what the war had done to the minds it processed. The science he was reaching for, the neurobiological basis of trauma response, the measurable physical changes in brain structure caused by chronic stress, didn't exist yet. It was being built, in pieces, by researchers who wouldn't begin to assemble it clearly until the 1990s, when studies of Vietnam veterans and blast-exposed soldiers from later wars began to find, in the brain tissue of men who'd survived combat, something very close to what Myers had originally proposed in 1915. Actual physical change. Microstructural damage. Myers's mechanism was wrong. His instinct that something physical, not merely emotional, was happening to these men was right. He was right for the wrong reason, and the right reason took another 80 years to find. The Craig Lockhart War Hospital no longer treats patients. It's a business school, part of Edinburgh Napier University. The building is well maintained. The rooms where Rivers met his patients are now seminar rooms. There's a small museum. Students walk through it. I imagine most of them don't know that Wilfred Owen wrote some of his most important poems in the rooms where they now study for their MBAs, or that the doctor who treated him was trying, in those same rooms, to invent a language for something the language of his time couldn't hold. Trauma. We have the word now. We use it so freely it's almost lost its weight. But it started somewhere, and part of where it started was in a converted hotel in Edinburgh in the war's third year, when a Cambridge anthropologist sat across from men who were coming apart and tried, with everything he had, to understand why. July the 1st. At 28 minutes past 7 on the morning of the 1st of July 1916, a British officer named Edward Living wrote in his private notebook. He kept it tucked inside his tunic, writing during odd silences, that he had just watched a great grey cloud of dust, smoke and earth rise slowly into the sky. He was watching the detonation of the mine beneath the Hawthorne Ridge redoubt. just north of the French village of Beaumont-Hamel. 40,600 pounds of ammonal explosive, packed into a tunnel driven 60 feet beneath a German strongpoint, detonated at 7:28, 10 minutes before 0 hour, which was supposed to destroy the position and clear the way for the attack. An army cinematographer named Jeffrey Mellons was there too, filming. The footage survives. It's one of the most watched seconds of First World War film. The ground heaves. A column of earth rises, hangs for a moment against the sky, and falls back. What the film doesn't show, what Living's notebook records, is what came next. The German soldiers in the surrounding positions heard the explosion 10 minutes before the infantry was due to advance. They emerged from their dugouts. They manned their guns. They waited. By 7:30, when the whistles blew and the men went forward, the German machine gunners at Beaumont-Hamel were ready. The 1st of July 1916 was the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. It was planned as the decisive offensive of the war, a 4-month build-up, 1.5 million shells in 7 days, 120,000 men along a 20-mile front, walking forward behind what GHQ had promised would be a destroyed German defensive system. The planning documents circulated to battalion commanders before the attack described the artillery's effects in confident terms. The wire was cut. The dugouts were destroyed. The men were to advance at the walk, in regular waves, to occupy positions that the bombardment had rendered essentially undefended. That is what the orders said. It is not what the orders found when they arrived at the German line. The German wire in the northern sectors was not cut, in part because a significant percentage of the shells in the preliminary bombardment were shrapnel, which is excellent for anti-personnel use in the open and largely useless for cutting wire, and in part because the dud rate in the British shells being fired was, in some estimates, approaching 1 in 3. The German dugouts, 30 feet deep in the chalk, constructed with steel and reinforced timber, had been largely impervious to the weight of metal that had been landing on their surface for 7 days. The men came out of the ground when the barrage lifted, mounted their fire steps, and opened fire on the advancing British infantry. The 1st Newfoundland Regiment went forward at 9:15 in the morning, after the first waves had already been cut down. They advanced from a position known as the St. John's Road, roughly 800 yards behind the German front line, because the communication trenches leading to the forward assembly positions were choked with the dead and wounded of the earlier waves. 801 men advanced. They had to cross 800 yards of open ground before reaching the first German positions. The regimental war diary's entry for 9:45 reads simply, "No communication with forward companies." Of the 801 men who went forward, 684 became casualties. Of those, 233 were killed, 386 were wounded, and 91 were posted missing, which meant, in the language of the Western Front, that they were dead in ground that hadn't yet been recovered. The following morning, the regiment mustered 68 men fit for duty from the 801 who'd gone over. 68. The regiment hadn't been fighting for days. It had been fighting for approximately 30 minutes. The commanding officer of the 29th Division, which included the Newfoundlanders, later submitted an after-action report describing the preliminary artillery as having sufficiently neutralized the Beaumont-Hamel defensive positions. The Newfoundland Regiment's own war diary, filed by Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Haddow, contains the following sentence. Wire in front of the enemy first line was found to be uncut. Both documents are in the archive. They describe the same morning in the same sector. They cannot both be correct. In the military history of the Western Front, this kind of source conflict is not exceptional. It appears so consistently, in so many sectors, on so many days, that it stops looking like discrepancy and starts looking like a pattern. The pattern is this. After-action reports written at division and above tend toward a language of partial accomplishment and explained failure. Reports written at battalion and below tend toward direct description of what the men physically encountered. The higher the headquarters, the cleaner the language. The closer to the ground, the more specific the wire. The southern end of the Somme attack on July the 1st tells a different story, and it's one the popular history of that day doesn't spend enough time with. At Montauban, roughly 8 miles south of Beaumont-Hamel, the British 13th Corps and the French 6th Army took all of their objectives by early afternoon. The 30th Division advanced nearly a mile and a half. Why? The artillery coordination was better. A higher proportion of heavy howitzers targeting German dugouts specifically rather than wire. The ground was harder chalk. Craters overlapped without creating the liquid mud that slowed movement in the northern sectors. The French artillery, working alongside, had more experience with this specific kind of fire and maneuver coordination. The disparity between north and south on that single day is, to me, the most important fact about the 1st of July. Because it means the catastrophe wasn't inevitable. The same attack, on the same day, against the same enemy, produced radically different results depending on how it was planned and resourced. The men who died in the north didn't die because the plan was impossible. They died because the plan was inconsistently executed in ways that some people, somewhere in the chain of command, had the information to anticipate and chose not to act on, or didn't know how to act on, or acted on too late. Field Marshal Haig's diary entry for the 1st of July, 1916, is 12 lines long. I've counted. It records heavy losses on the left and notes that the German forces had been very difficult to overcome. It records this in the tone of a man describing an unexpectedly poor cricket score. 57,470 British and Dominion casualties in one day. The single bloodiest day in the entire history of the British Army, before or since. And 12 lines. I'm not sure what a proportionate diary entry would look like. I'm not sure what the right length is for a response to 19,240 dead men. But 12 lines is very short. The Hawthorne Ridge mine detonation 10 minutes early deserves more analytical attention than it usually gets, because the decision behind it was not random. The mine was detonated early because the officer responsible was following orders that had been debated and changed at multiple levels of command in the preceding days. Some officers had argued for detonating the mines simultaneously with 0 hour. Others had argued for detonating them several hours before to allow the dust to settle and the ground to stabilize before the infantry advanced. The 10-minute compromise was, in the end, the worst of both options. Early enough to warn the Germans, not early enough to provide any tactical advantage. It was a committee decision, filed in writing, that killed a specific number of people at a specific time in a specific place. The committee didn't know it was doing that. The committee was trying to solve a genuine tactical problem with inadequate information and time pressure. But the 10-minute gap between the mine going up and the men going over is in the record. And the men who died in it are in the record. And the decision that connected those two facts is in the record. That's what archives are for. The battle continued for 4.5 months after July the 1st. The British attacked again and again and again. At Pozières, at Delville Wood, at Thiepval, at the Ancre. Tanks were used for the first time in the history of warfare at Flers-Courcelette in September of 1916, to limited tactical effect and significant mechanical unreliability. By November the 18th, when Field Marshal Haig formally ended the offensive, the maximum British advance at any point along the front was roughly 7 miles. Final British and Dominion casualties, approximately 419,654. Final French casualties, approximately 200,000. German casualties, estimated somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000, with the archival sources sufficiently contradictory that no definitive figure has ever been agreed upon. 7 miles. The distance from central London to the airport at Heathrow is roughly 14 miles. The Somme, over 4.5 months, moved the Western Front roughly half that distance. The 684 Newfoundlanders who became casualties on July 1st, 1916, came from a place that wasn't yet formally a dominion of the British Empire. Newfoundland wouldn't achieve dominion status until 1917, a year after the battle. They were British subjects of a kind that the constitutional categories of the time didn't quite contain. They'd volunteered, most of them, in 1914 and 15, in numbers that represented a significant fraction of Newfoundland's total population. The regiment had been formed, trained, and sent to Gallipoli before it came to the Somme. The men who walked forward at 9:15 on July 1st weren't professional soldiers in any technical sense. They were fishermen, trappers, merchants, teachers in the main. They wore the same uniform as the men on their left and their right. They carried the same rifles. They walked at the same pace into the same wire. The war didn't distinguish between the professionally trained and the recently volunteered. Neither did the German machine guns. I want to say something carefully here. The Battle of the Somme is often discussed in terms of the incompetence of its commanders, and particularly of Haig. That debate is real, and I'm not dismissing it. The evidence for serious planning failures on July 1st is substantial and is in the documentary record. But I've spent enough time with the sources to be cautious about the simpler version of that argument. Haig was under strategic pressure from the French, who were being consumed at Verdun. The British Army of 1916 was, in large part, Kitchener's new army, volunteers who'd been training for 18 months and had never fought a major engagement. The logistical and artillery coordination required for the kind of sophisticated attack that would have given better results simply wasn't yet present in the BEF in sufficient quantities or at sufficient levels of training. The army learned from the Somme. It learned in the most expensive possible way, at the cost that it cost, and the learning was real. Whether that learning required the specific mechanism of the 1st of July, whether those specific 19,240 dead men were the necessary price of what was learned, is a question that I don't think military history, as a discipline, has the tools to answer. The question is there in the archive. The archive doesn't answer it. The Tacticians' War. There's a document that I think of as the before and after of the Western Front in a single comparison. The first document is Field Service Regulations, 1909 edition, the British Army's governing tactical doctrine for infantry attack. It instructs that the attack shall be delivered in successive waves, each wave moving at the walk until within assault distance, at which point the double shall be adopted. Walking men, in lines, toward a defended position. That's the doctrine. Then there's a second document, Instructions for the Training of Platoons for Offensive Action, issued by British GHQ as SS-143 in February of 1917. It describes a platoon divided into 4 functional groups: Lewis gunners, rifle bombers, bombers with grenades, and a rifle section, each assigned a specific tactical task, each capable of operating independently, each expected to exploit success without waiting for orders from neighbouring units. The platoon shall not wait for neighbours, but shall exploit success independently. Those 2 documents are separated by less than 8 years. In practice, they describe different species of military organisation. What separated them was not 8 years of peacetime evolution. It was 18 months of blood-purchased learning on the Western Front. The Lewis gun is where I'd start if someone asked me to identify the single piece of equipment that most changed infantry tactics on the Western Front. Not the tank, not the aircraft. The Lewis gun. A light machine gun that weighed 28 pounds, could be carried and fired by one man, and fed from a circular drum magazine of 47 rounds. It was first issued to the BEF in significant numbers from 1915 onward, and by 1916, each infantry platoon had one Lewis gun section. By 1918, the standard establishment was 2 Lewis guns per platoon. The Vickers machine gun, the heavy weapon that had held defensive positions since 1914, weighed 51 pounds for the gun body alone, plus the tripod, plus the water cooling jacket and the water to fill it, plus the ammunition belts, plus the crew to carry and operate it. It was a crew-served weapon that needed a prepared position, time to set up, and multiple men to sustain. The Lewis gun was what one man could carry at a run and fire from a prone position while his section moved. That difference, between a weapon that required a fixed crew and a weapon that moved with the infantry, is the difference between the tactical doctrine of 1914 and the tactical doctrine of 1918. The Lewis gun made the platoon a self-contained firepower and maneuver unit. Before it, the platoon was a mass of riflemen dependent entirely on artillery support for suppression. After it, the platoon could suppress and move simultaneously. That's not a refinement of tactics, it's a reconception of what infantry can do. The German army arrived at its own tactical revolution by a different route. The concept of Stoßtruppen, stormtroopers, assault units trained in infiltration tactics, was developed on the Eastern Front and formalized by General Oskar von Hutier, then transferred to the Western Front in 1917. The Hutier method dispensed with the broad front attack and replaced it with small, self-sustaining groups of specially selected soldiers who were trained to bypass strongpoints, push through gaps in the defensive line, attack headquarters and supply depots, and leave the isolated strongpoints to be destroyed by follow-on forces. The tactical logic was to attack the enemy's coherence rather than his fortifications, to get inside his decision-making cycle and disrupt it before he could respond. The British GHQ intelligence staff translated the relevant German training pamphlets and circulated them to divisional commanders. The translation is at the National Archives. The commanders who received it had, in some cases, already been trying to build equivalent capabilities. The armies were converging on similar ideas from different directions through the shared laboratory of the same battlefield. The 9th of April, 1917, is a date that matters in this story of tactical learning, and it matters because of what it produced rather than merely what it cost. The Canadian Corps, 4 divisions, roughly 100,000 men, operating under British General Julian Byng, with the tactical planning heavily influenced by Arthur Currie and Major Alan Brooke, the 33-year-old artillery officer who designed the rolling barrage, attacked Vimy Ridge at 5:30 in the morning behind a precisely timed creeping barrage that advanced 100 yards every 3 minutes. Not in a general line, timed to the exact walking speed of infantry in full kit over broken ground. Each section of the advance had a specific artillery line and a specific scheduled time at which that line would move forward. Soldiers had been issued individual maps, which was unusual in 1917. Previously, only officers typically carried maps of the ground they were attacking across. The Canadian Corps had spent the preceding weeks rehearsing the attack on a full-scale replica of the German trench system, constructed in the rear areas using aerial photographs and prisoner intelligence. Brooke's barrage moved at 3-minute intervals. The men followed it. Within 4 hours, the Canadian Corps had taken ground that French and British forces had failed to take for 2 years. The ridge fell. For the first time in the war, all 4 Canadian divisions had attacked simultaneously in a coordinated operation and achieved all their objectives. The contrast between Vimy and the Somme, 11 months earlier, is not simply a story of individual commanders getting better. It's a story of institutional learning accumulating to a threshold. The lessons of the Somme, about artillery accuracy, about infantry-artillery coordination, about the need for soldiers to understand the plan rather than simply follow orders, had been absorbed, imperfectly but genuinely, into British and Dominion operational practice by the spring of 1917. Brooke's barrage plan wasn't a new idea. Rolling barrages had been used before. What was new was the precision of its calibration to infantry movement and the degree of rehearsal invested in making the coordination real rather than theoretical. There's a source conflict in the historical record at this point that I find genuinely interesting. British General Allenby's GHQ report on Vimy credits the success primarily to the artillery preparation. Curry's own post-battle analysis credits it primarily to soldier-level training and map-reading exercises. Both men are describing the same operation. The disagreement about which element was decisive reflects a broader argument that runs through the entire second half of the Western Front, about whether firepower or maneuver was the fundamental driver of tactical success, and it hasn't been entirely resolved to this day. At Cambrai on the 20th of November 1917, something happened that church bells in London hadn't rung for since the war began. 476 Mark IV tanks, the largest concentration of armoured vehicles in history to that point, advanced along a 6-mile front without a preliminary artillery bombardment. No registration, no 7-day shelling, no warning. A smoke barrage, then the tanks, then the infantry. By the end of the day, the British had advanced approximately 5 miles on the first day alone, more than the combined total advance of the Somme and Passchendaele. 8,000 German prisoners, 100 guns captured. The tank's potential, as a weapon capable of crossing wire and suppressing machine guns simultaneously, was demonstrated beyond reasonable argument. London rang its bells. 10 days later, a German counterattack using Hutier's infiltration methods, applied against the British rear, not the front, recovered most of the ground. The bells stopped. But the demonstration had been made. The question after Cambrai wasn't whether tanks worked. It was whether the British Army understood yet how to integrate them with infantry and artillery in a system rather than simply as armoured battering rams. The Mark IV that fought at Cambrai weighed 28 tons and moved at 3.5 miles per hour on level, firm ground. It had a crew of 8, 4 to operate the engine and steering, 4 to crew the weapons. The male variant carried 2 6-pounder guns. The female variant carried 4 Lewis guns. The planetary gearbox that translated the engine's power to the tracks required the driver and 2 gear operators to coordinate steering changes simultaneously. A 3-man communication operation for every turn, conducted in a vehicle filled with engine noise and carbon monoxide, and temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The expected mechanical breakdown rate was approximately 1 in 20 hours of operation. At Cambrai, 179 tanks were lost on the first day, 65 knocked out by the enemy, 71 suffering mechanical defects, and 43 by other causes. The machine that changed warfare in the morning was by the afternoon of the same day, revealing its limitations with equal clarity. What the Western Front was doing in the second half of its existence was inventing modern combined arms warfare through the most expensive research and development process in human history. The creeping barrage, the self-sustaining platoon, the predicted fire artillery technique, calculating gun ranges from maps and atmospheric data without registration, so no warning was given to the enemy. The integration of tanks and aircraft and infantry and logistics in a single coordinated operational plan. All of these elements were being assembled, tested, revised, and reassembled between 1916 and 1918 in a laboratory whose test subjects were measured in bodies. By 1918, the best British and Dominion commanders were operating with a doctrinal sophistication that didn't exist anywhere in 1914. It had been built from scratch by men who were learning under fire in 4 years. The doctrine is real. It's still taught. The cost of its construction is also real. Both facts coexist in the same archive, and neither one cancels the other. The doctrine that emerged from the Western Front's tactical evolution was called, in the language that British military writing developed for it, all-arms battle. The coordinated employment of infantry, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and logistics in a single operational framework where each element amplifies the others. It was not called that in 1918. It was called in 1918 what was working. The naming came later, in the staff colleges, in the doctrine manuals, in the analytical work of officers who survived and spent the 1920s and 30s trying to explain what they'd learned. What they'd learned had cost approximately 1 million British and Dominion casualties. Whether there was a cheaper way to learn it, whether a different command culture, different initial doctrine, different political decisions could have arrived at the same tactical destination by a less catastrophic route, is one of the central questions of Western Front historiography. I don't have a confident answer. The historians don't entirely agree. The dead aren't available for comment. When the ground became the enemy. There is a supplementary note appended to British survey maps of the Passchendaele sector, dated the 10th of August, 1917. It reads, "Low-lying areas indicated as normal are currently inundated to a depth of 12 to 18 inches. Artillery preparation has destroyed drainage system entirely." This note was circulated to Corps headquarters. There is no documentary evidence that it reached GHQ's planning staff before the offensive continued. The maps it was attached to showed the Flemish plain in standard topographic notation: brown contour lines, elevation figures, grid coordinates. The maps had no symbol for what the supplementary note was describing. The mapping convention in use by the field survey companies had no category for "the surface is liquid." That gap between what the survey system could represent and what the ground actually was is a precise technical description of the command problem at Passchendaele. The Third Battle of Ypres opened on the 31st of July, 1917. It followed the most intensive artillery preparation yet attempted on the Western Front. 4.5 million shells fired over a period of roughly 15 days along the Ypres salient front. The specific geology of the Flemish coastal plain mattered here in a way that the planning hadn't adequately incorporated, and the science behind it is worth understanding. The soil of the low-lying areas around Ypres is polder clay, Flemish coastal clay, deposited over centuries of tidal and river sedimentation, with an extremely low permeability. Water moves through it at a rate of approximately 1 centimetre per day. The agricultural viability of the region had historically depended on a maintained network of drainage ditches and sluices, some of which dated back to medieval land management. The preliminary bombardment of 4.5 million shells, 45 times more shells than the Battle of the Somme had consumed in its entire preliminary phase per comparable frontage, destroyed this drainage network completely. It didn't just crater the surface, it perforated the system of channels that had been moving water through the Flemish clay since the 12th century. When the rain began, and it began, as if on some malicious schedule, on the 31st of July, the first morning of the offensive, the water that fell had nowhere to go. It saturated the disturbed clay, mixed with the pulverized chalk and earth of the craters, and produced the substance that every account of Passchendaele, from every direction, describes in the same terms: a brown, semi-liquid mud of extraordinary viscosity, capable of holding a man in place against his own efforts to free himself, capable, in places, of drowning him. The human-specific matters here in a way that aggregate statistics don't capture. What I want to do is sit with a particular documented fact. Soldiers' letters from the Passchendaele sector in August and September of 1917 contain, with a consistency that amounts to independent corroboration, descriptions of men being lost in the mud. Not lost as a euphemism. Lost in the literal sense. men sinking into waterlogged craters and being unable to get out, and other men being unable to pull them out against the suction of the clay, and the stretchermen being told there was nothing to be done, and the man being left. There are letters in the Imperial War Museum's collection from soldiers describing this with a specific kind of careful prose. Careful because the writer is trying not to write the thing he is writing. He is saying the man sank and we left him, and then he is describing something else, because there is nothing else to say. The mud didn't just make the battle difficult. It made it grotesque in a way that the artillery at Verdun and the wire at the Somme had not. Those were weapons, and weapons have an architectural logic. Mud has no logic. It simply claims. Haig's diary throughout the Third Ypres campaign records weather as a logistical note. His entry for the 5th of August reads, "Rain has impeded movement. Roads in poor condition." The 2nd Australian Division's war diary for the same period describes all approaches to forward areas as impassable to wheeled transport. Wounded unable to be evacuated. Stretcher parties of 12 men required per casualty across broken ground. One document is a note about roads. The other is a record of men dying because they couldn't be moved. I'm not citing this to condemn Haig for indifference. I think the psychological compartmentalization of a military commander in the field is a real phenomenon, and a partially necessary one. A commander who emotionally engaged with every death under his command would have broken in the first week. But the gap between the language at the top of the command hierarchy and the language at the bottom is, in the Passchendaele record, larger than anywhere else on the Western Front. It's worth sitting with that gap. Not as a judgment, but as a description. Haig's defenders, and there are serious historians among them, Gary Sheffield being the most prominent, argue that the Third Ypres offensive served a genuine strategic purpose. It drew German reserves away from the French front, which was still recovering from the mutinies of May and June, and it demonstrated continued British offensive capability at a moment when the Allied strategic situation was precarious. They argue that calling off the offensive in August, when the mud was worst, would have allowed German reserves to be redistributed in ways that might have been catastrophic for France. This case can be made. Haig's own December 1917 report to the War Cabinet makes essentially this argument. The report does not describe what the Australian War Diary describes for the 5th of August. The report describes objectives and strategic outcomes, and German reserves redeployed. Both documents are real. Both describe the Third Ypres campaign. The reader gets to decide how to weigh them. By November of 1917, the Canadian Corps had been sent north from their sector to take over the final objectives of the Third Ypres offensive. The village of Passchendaele itself, the name that the battle eventually took, the name that has become synonymous with everything worst about the Western Front, was taken by the 1st Canadian Division on the 6th of November. A photograph taken the following day shows what the village consisted of. 3 brick stumps in a field of brown mud. There was no village. There were remnants of walls rising a foot or two above the mud surface. The Canadians had been brought north after their success at Vimy and Hill 70 to finish capturing an objective that was, by November, a geographic point rather than a habitable location. Total Third Ypres casualties. Approximately 310,000 British and Dominion, roughly 260,000 German. The maximum depth of advance. Approximately 5 miles, in the shape of a shallow arc extending from the Ypres salient. It is the most expensive 5 miles in British military history. The artillery created the trap it then fired into. I want to be precise about this, because it's not a figure of speech. The 4.5 million shells of the preliminary bombardment didn't simply announce the attack and crater the surface. They destroyed the drainage network whose failure produced the mud. The guns created the conditions that made the gun's own effect usable only against men already lost in the ground. There's a specific quality to this that I find very difficult to move past quickly. The machine that was supposed to facilitate the advance instead created the physical environment that made advance almost impossible, and then continued firing into that environment for 3 months. The army that had learned, at Vimy, how to coordinate a rolling barrage with infantry movement, then applied that doctrine to a battlefield where the infantry was waist-deep in clay. The learning and the failure coexisted in the same operation, in the same months, and neither one cancelled the other out. The soil surveys of the former Passchendaele battlefield, conducted under Belgian environmental regulations in the decades after the war, are a different kind of archive from the war diaries. They are tables of chemical analysis. Arsenic concentrations measured in milligrams per kilogram of dry soil, compared against EU-permitted agricultural standards. In the core battle zone, arsenic concentrations range up to 3,000 times the permitted agricultural limit. The ground that consumed these men is still chemically hostile to human use. Farmers in the region are officially advised against growing root vegetables in certain fields. The Zone Rouge, the permanent exclusion zone around the worst affected areas, remains legally uninhabitable, and the iron harvest continues. Belgian bomb disposal teams, in 2026, are still recovering unexploded ordnance from fields that were the Passchendaele battlefield. Hundreds of call-outs per year. 200 to 300 tons of ordnance recovered annually from the entire Western Front zone. The battle ended in 1917. The ground has not recovered. The mutinies nobody talks about. There is a single sheet of paper in the French military archives that is, in my reading of the Western Front's documentary record, the most consequential document of the entire war. It's a personal note from General Philippe Pétain to his Chief of Operations, dated the 2nd of June, 1917. It concerns the wave of collective refusals that had begun spreading through the French army following the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive the previous month. The note says, in Pétain's precise administrative French, that this affair is being kept to themselves. The they is the French High Command. The affairs being kept to themselves are the mutinies of approximately 68 of France's 112 infantry divisions. That is a document written by the man who managed the most serious institutional crisis in the history of the French army, deciding, in real time, that the British, the Germans, and the French government would not be fully informed of what was happening. The cover story held. The decisions made in its shadow shaped the rest of the war. The Nivelle offensive began on the 16th of April, 1917, along a ridge in Champagne called the Chemin des Dames. General Robert Nivelle had spent the preceding months promising, with a confidence that his military colleagues found impressive and his subordinates found alarming, that he would rupture the German front in 24 hours using a new artillery method. He was so confident that he had shared his plan with the press. The Germans, who had intelligence assets and read French newspapers, had known the precise location and general method of the attack for weeks, and had adjusted their defensive positions accordingly. Nivelle attacked anyway. On the first day, approximately 30,000 French casualties. Minimal ground gained. Nivelle continued the attack for 10 days after it was clear it had failed, and then for another week after that, and then another. By the time he was finally relieved in mid-May, French casualties in the Nivelle offensive totaled approximately 187,000 men. The offensive had produced no strategic result. The men who had survived it had watched their comrades die for a promise that was empty from the beginning. The mutinies began with units of the 21st Division in early May. They spread. By the end of June, 68 of France's 112 divisions had experienced some form of collective refusal to participate in offensive operations, some involving hundreds of men refusing to march to the front, some involving entire battalions sitting down and singing, some involving soldiers arriving at the line drunk and stating, in the plainest possible terms, that they would defend their position but would not be sent forward to die in attacks they knew to be pointless. The mutinies were not, in the main, about desertion. The men were not running away. The specific character of the refusals, we will hold the line, we will not attack, was, in its way, a more devastating indictment of the command system than simple flight would have been. It said, "We understand the war, we accept our obligation to defend, and we no longer accept the specific use of our bodies as material for offensives designed by men who are not standing where we are standing." Pétain replaced Nivelle on the 15th of May and set about managing the crisis with the specific combination of selective severity and structural concession that made him, for a time, the most effective commander on the Western Front. His response had two components. The first was legal. Court-martials for identified ringleaders, targeted rather than general, with a relatively low execution rate. Approximately 49 confirmed death sentences carried out, although other estimates run slightly higher, against a backdrop of over 100,000 courts-martial proceedings of varying severity. The second was the critical element: real material improvement for the surviving soldiers. Pétain implemented a formal leave system, guaranteeing every French soldier 7 days of leave every 4 months, a logistical operation that, to be delivered across a force of nearly 3 million men, required approximately 700,000 leave passes per month, a bureaucratic and transport commitment comparable in complexity to a medium-sized national railway system. He improved food quality, reduced the intensity of purely offensive operations, publicly promised no more Nivelle-style attacks, and, critically, kept the entire nature and extent of the crisis away from Allied commanders and the German High Command simultaneously. Haig's diary records, in late May of 1917, a conversation with the French Chief of Staff in which he was informed that French forces were undergoing a period of spiritual fatigue. That is the phrase that reached him. Spiritual fatigue. The German intelligence apparatus, which had intercepts, informants in Paris, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner reports, noted in its June 1917 assessments unusual quiet on French sectors and evidence of possible command difficulties. The German OHL's response was to consolidate existing positions and wait. They didn't probe, they didn't press. Whether this was strategic caution, overconfidence, or simple intelligence failure isn't entirely clear from the German records. What is clear is that Germany had its best opportunity to win the war in May and June of 1917, when the French army was in the process of institutional collapse, and it didn't recognize the opportunity clearly enough to act on it. If the German High Command had launched a major offensive against the recovering French front in June of 1917, the operational consequences might have been severe enough to force the Allies to negotiate. They didn't. The mutinies remained hidden. The war continued. There is a source conflict at the heart of the mutiny story that hasn't been cleanly resolved by historical scholarship. French official histories published before 1967 don't mention the mutinies at all. Their existence was effectively a state secret until Guy Pedroncini's doctoral thesis in 1967, which first fully documented their scope. Since then, historians have debated the numbers. How many divisions were truly affected, and what affected means in practice? Pedroncini counted 68 divisions showing some form of refusal. Wikipedia's article on the mutinies, drawing on later scholarship, suggests 43% of French infantry divisions were affected by year's end. Both figures are probably right for different definitions of affected. A battalion where 20 men refuse to march is different from a division where 3 regiments sit down in the road. The archive makes these distinctions. The popular account of the mutinies doesn't usually bother. Pétain's decision to execute approximately 49 men rather than several hundred was not mercy. It was calculation. His operational notes describe the target execution rate explicitly in terms of deterrence. Enough to demonstrate that refusal carried consequences, not so many as to generalize resentment into something that couldn't be managed. The ratio of men prosecuted to to the total number of men who participated in some form of refusal was roughly 1 in several hundred. The majority of mutineers went unpunished or were transferred or received brief prison sentences. This was deliberate. It was a managed suppression rather than a suppression by force, and it worked, in the specific sense that the French army continued to hold its defensive positions, did not collapse, and was capable of offensive operations again by October of 1917, when Pétain sanctioned limited attacks with limited objectives that succeeded and helped rebuild confidence. The French army that crossed the Rhine in November of 1918 was not the French army that sat down in the Chemin des Dames in May of 1917. Pétain had rebuilt it. That is also a real fact, and it complicates the straightforward condemnation of his wartime record without changing the permanent stain of his later one. The German spring offensive of March 1918 was designed on an assumption that the French army was still recovering from the events of 1917 and could not sustain a major attack. This assumption was partially correct. What the Germans didn't know was the precise degree to which the recovery had progressed. And they also didn't know that the British army, which would bear the first impact of Operation Michael, was simultaneously exhausted from Passchendaele and Cambrai. The respective crises of the two Allied armies were timed slightly out of synchronization with each other. The French were recovering as the British were being hit hardest. Whether a German offensive in June of 1917 aimed at the recovering French rather than the resilient British would have succeeded differently is one of those counterfactuals that military historians enjoy and that the archive can't definitively resolve. What the archive can say is this. In May and June of 1917, both major Allied armies on the Western Front were simultaneously in states of serious institutional difficulty. Neither side knew the full extent of the other's crisis. The war continued. The mutinies were successfully hidden. And 300 years of later military sociologists studying collective refusal have used the French army of 1917 as their foundational dataset, because it is the most extensively documented case of disciplined soldiers collectively refusing suicidal orders in the history of modern warfare, and because it worked. The men who sat down in the road in May of 1917 were, within 12 months, living through an armistice. The specific connection between their refusal and that outcome is not a simple causal chain, but it is not no connection either. The last gamble. Erich Ludendorff, the effective operational commander of the German army in 1918, was asked at some point during the planning of the spring offensive what would happen after the initial breakthrough, where the attack would go strategically once the Allied lines were breached. His reported answer, preserved in post-war accounts and widely cited by military historians, was, "We punch a hole. The rest follows of itself." This is not strategy. This is the operational logic of a man who has calculated that he cannot win on current terms, cannot afford to wait, and has decided that momentum and audacity might produce an outcome that strategic planning cannot guarantee. It's the logic of a gambler who's down to his last chips and is going all in on a hand he knows is probably not strong enough. Ludendorff knew, by early 1918, what the arithmetic of the Western Front showed. Germany had transferred 44 divisions from the Russian front following the October Revolution, giving it a temporary numerical advantage in the West. That advantage would last until the American expeditionary forces arrived in sufficient numbers to tip the balance back, which would be, by the most optimistic estimates, late summer of 1918. There was a window. It was closing. And inside that window, Ludendorff proposed to end the war. At 40 minutes past 4, on the morning of the 21st of March, 1918, approximately 10,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front facing the British 3rd and 5th Armies. The British GHQ War Diary records, 0440, heavy bombardment commenced on 3rd and 5th Army fronts. Pattern unclear. Nature of attack unclear. Pattern unclear. That phrase is Colonel Georg Bruchmüller's work. Bruchmüller was the most technically innovative artillery officer of the war on either side, and his fire plan for Operation Michael dispensed with the standard preliminary bombardment, the week-long shelling that announced every previous major offensive and allowed the defender to bring up reserves, and replaced it with a 5-hour hurricane barrage, precisely designed to disorient rather than destroy. The sequence was calibrated. First, gas shells against British artillery batteries, targeting the guns' crews with mustard and phosgene, forcing the crews into respirators that reduced their effectiveness. Then, high explosive against command posts, telephone exchanges, and supply dumps, the nervous system of the defensive position. Then a final mixed barrage of smoke and gas and high explosive against the front line, precisely timed to lift as the stormtroopers advanced. By the time the British Fifth Army understood what was happening, 3 German armies with 65 divisions and over 6,600 artillery guns were moving through its disintegrating positions. The first 3 days of Operation Michael produced results that nobody on the Allied side had believed were still possible after 4 years of Western Front stalemate. By the 23rd of March, German forces had advanced 40 miles in some sectors, more ground in 72 hours than the Somme had produced in 4.5 months. General Gough's Fifth Army was in effective collapse, the coherent defensive line dissolving into a series of rearguard actions by individual units that had lost communication with their flanks and their headquarters. On the 11th of April, Haig issued what became known as his "backs to the wall" order, a message to every man in the BEF stating that there was no retreat, that the enemy must be stopped wherever he stood, that each position must be held to the last. It was the language of genuine emergency, and the emergency was genuine. On the same day, Lloyd George told the War Cabinet that the war might be lost. These were not rhetorical performances. They were realistic assessments of the situation as it stood on the 11th of April, 1918. The Doullens Conference on the 26th of March produced the single structural reform that 4 years of Allied command failure had not. Haig and Pétain, 2 commanders who had significant personal and professional reservations about each other, agreed, in a meeting that lasted approximately 90 minutes, to place French General Ferdinand Foch in supreme command of all Allied forces on the Western Front. The decision transferred national command sovereignty in a way that both men had previously resisted and that their governments had previously refused. It happened because the alternative was visible. Without unified command, the British and French were making independent defensive decisions that were pulling their armies in opposite directions, each trying to protect its own national priority. Paris for the French, the Channel ports for the British, and neither properly covering the junction between them. Foch's unified command didn't immediately stop the German advance, but it ended the Allied command paralysis. It meant that reserves could be moved, lines could be coordinated, and the overall defensive response could be managed as a system rather than as 2 separate national emergencies happening adjacently. Why did Operation Michael ultimately fail? The standard answer, German logistics, is correct, but the mechanics deserve more precision. The stormtroopers who spearheaded the advance carried rations and ammunition sufficient for approximately 72 to 96 hours of independent operation. They were light infantry in the full sense, fast, aggressive, capable of bypassing strong points and driving deep into rear areas. What they were not capable of was sustained advance beyond the range of their initial supply. By the 4th day of the offensive, the leading elements had outrun the horse-drawn supply wagons by 20 to 30 miles, and the roads they'd advanced along weren't capable of supporting the weight of resupply columns at the pace the advance required. In some sectors, particularly around Péronne and Noyon, German stormtroopers moving through captured British positions stopped to eat. Not metaphorically. They stopped the tactical advance to eat the British Army's rations because they hadn't eaten in 2 days. The German blockade situation. The Royal Navy's blockade had reduced German civilian caloric intake to under 1,000 calories per day by late 1917, and army rations had been cut in sympathy, meant that the elite infantry of the spring offensive was, by day 3, physically depleted in ways that operational planning hadn't adequately accounted for. German Army Group reports describe the pause as the result of stubborn British resistance. The British Fifth Army's own war diary for the same period describes withdrawal in progress with minimal coherent resistance in most sectors. The German advance stopped against physics, not against guns. The subsequent spring offensives, Operation Georgette in Flanders in April, the Aisne offensive in May, the Matz offensive in June, the second Marne offensive in July, each followed the same pattern with diminishing returns. Initial breakthrough, rapid advance, logistical stall, Allied recovery. And each one consumed German manpower at a rate Germany could not sustain. Total German casualties across all 5 spring offensives, from March to July of 1918. Approximately 800,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Included in that number were the majority of Germany's elite stormtrooper divisions, the specifically selected, specifically trained, best-equipped infantry that had been the operational cutting edge of the Kaiserschlacht. These men weren't replaceable. Germany's conscription pool had been drawing down for 4 years. The replacements being sent forward in the summer of 1918 were teenagers or middle-aged men who'd been held back from the front for specific industrial or administrative reasons. The army that had launched Operation Michael in March was not the army that faced Foch's counteroffensive in August. It was the same army in name. In operational capacity, it was something considerably reduced. The intelligence failure on both sides in the spring of 1918 is, on reflection, remarkable. Germany knew the American build-up was coming and gambled that the window of temporary numerical advantage was sufficient to force a decision. The gamble was rational, in the abstract. What Ludendorff's planning hadn't fully weighted was the specific psychological resilience of the BEF by 1918, an army that had been through Ypres and the Somme and Passchendaele, and was, in that specific way, inoculated against the kind of shock that the rapid German advance was designed to produce. The Fifth Army broke. The rest of the BEF bent very badly. It didn't break completely. Whether that resilience was the result of training, institutional culture, leadership, or the simple survivor psychology of men who'd already been through worse is a question that I don't think has a clean answer. The archive shows the outcome. It doesn't always show the inside of it. The phrase Ludendorff used, "We punch a hole, the rest follows of itself," is the defining epigram of the German strategic position in 1918. It's the language of a man who has ceased to believe that coherent strategy can deliver what improvised audacity might. It's not unintelligent. In certain limited tactical circumstances, it describes something real. An opening created by decisive action can generate opportunities that no planning anticipated. But it's not a war-winning strategy. It's a desperation measure dressed in operational language. And the rest did not follow of itself. The hole was punched. The Allied line bent 40 miles. And then the Allied line held, and Foch managed the recovery. And the German army that had staked its last operational reserve on "the rest follows of itself" had no reserve left when the rest didn't. The Black Day. Erich Ludendorff called it that himself. In his diary, the entry for the 8th of August, 1918, he used the phrase, "the Black Day of the German army." And what makes the phrase significant is that he wasn't describing losses. He was describing something harder to quantify and more damaging than casualties. He was describing the look on the faces of German soldiers who had been marching toward the Allied lines and had turned around. Units that had thrown down their rifles. Men who, when reinforcements were coming forward on the roads, had shouted at them that they were prolonging a war that was already lost. Ludendorff had seen German soldiers die for 4 years. He'd sent enough of them to their deaths himself. What he hadn't seen, what nobody on the German side had seen since the war settled into its trench logic in the autumn of 1914, was German soldiers walking away from a fight in daylight, in groups, without being forced to. The 8th of August didn't break the German army with casualties. It broke it with the visible proof that the will to continue was no longer universal. The operational plan for the Battle of Amiens was a document of extraordinary precision, and the precision was in the deception as much as the attack itself. The Canadian Corps had become, by 1918, the most reliable indicator on the Western Front that a major attack was coming. German intelligence knew that where the Canadians appeared, an offensive followed. So the Amiens deception plan worked backward from that intelligence reality. 2 Canadian battalions were sent north to the Ypres area with orders to make their presence known, to be seen, to let themselves be identified. Signals traffic consistent with the Canadian Corps headquarters was broadcast from the Ypres sector. The actual Corps was moved south to the Amiens sector at night, in complete signals silence, with all shoulder patches removed from uniforms and all movement restricted to darkness. No Canadian divisional headquarters was permitted to relocate to the Amiens area until 48 hours before the attack. German aerial reconnaissance over the assembly area was suppressed by RAF fighter patrols. The Germans did not know the Canadians were at Amiens until the morning of the attack. At 4:20 on the morning of the 8th of August, 420 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, and roughly 120,000 infantry moved forward simultaneously behind a dense early morning mist and a precisely timed creeping barrage. No preliminary bombardment, no registration shells to announce the range. The artillery had calculated its fire from maps and atmospheric data alone. Predicted fire, the technique developed through 1917. So the German forward positions had no warning that the guns were coming until the shells were already landing. The mist did the rest, grounding German aircraft and obscuring ground observation. German forward units were overrun before they could report what was happening. By midday, the advance had moved roughly 8 miles in some sectors. German prisoners taken that day, approximately 12,000. German divisions effectively destroyed as fighting formations, 8. In terms of single-day performance, it was the most successful offensive operation the British and Dominion forces had ever conducted on the Western Front. The Canadian Corps under Arthur Currie, the former real estate agent from Victoria, British Columbia, who'd become the most effective corps commander in the BEF, had by August of 1918 developed a way of fighting that bore almost no resemblance to the tactical doctrine of 1914. Everything moved together. Tanks suppressing machine gun positions, infantry following close behind, aircraft flying ahead to bomb headquarters and supply lines, artillery shifting by pre-planned lifts every 3 minutes, engineers bridging craters immediately behind the advance. The coordination was real, and it worked. What's also real is that Currie's corps took 9,074 casualties in the 3 days following the 8th of August. Fewer in 3 days than the 1st Newfoundland Regiment had taken in 30 minutes 2 years earlier, for vastly greater results. The cost-to-outcome ratio had changed by a factor that defies easy calculation. I find both halves of that comparison necessary. The improvement was genuine. 9,000 casualties in 3 days is still 9,000 human beings. The tank problem at Amiens illustrates, in miniature, the gap between the weapon's potential and its limitations. Of the 420 tanks that started the battle on the 8th of August, 145 were put out of action on the first day. By August 10th, only 38 tanks were still operational. Mechanical breakdown, Specifically, the failure of the planetary gearbox under sustained operation was the primary cause, not enemy action. The Mark V tank had an expected operational lifespan of approximately 20 hours before breakdown became likely. At Amiens, the tanks had been running since before dawn on the 8th, and by the end of the second day, the attrition of mechanical failure had reduced the armoured force to a fraction of its opening strength. The tank of 1918 was decisive. It was also fragile. The combination of those two facts defined the weapon's tactical role throughout the 100 days, crucial for breaking the initial position, increasingly unavailable as the battle continued. The 100 Days offensive that followed Amiens, the series of coordinated Allied attacks that ran from the 8th of August to the 11th of November, striking different sectors of the German line in rapid rotation before German reserves could recover, was Foch's operational concept, and it was built on a single insight. The German army's resilience in 1918 was partly a function of its ability to reinforce any threatened sector with reserves that the fixed Western Front geography made available. If the Allies attacked one sector and stopped, the Germans reinforced and stabilized. If the Allies attacked one sector, then another, rotating the point of pressure faster than the German reserve system could respond, the defenders never had time to reconstitute. Foch called this everything at once. His staff called it operational tempo. Between August and November, Germany lost approximately 300,000 prisoners, a figure that tells you more about the German army's late-war collapse of will than any casualty count does. You take 300,000 prisoners from an army that is still capable of organized resistance. You don't take them from an army that has decided to stop. Haig's diary entry for the 8th of August, 1918, runs to several pages. He used the phrase, "Everything went according to plan." I noted, when writing the chapter on the 1st of July, that his entry for that day was 12 lines. I'm not suggesting the contrast proves something simple about the man's character. The situations were genuinely different, the outcomes genuinely different, and commanders under pressure write differently when the news is good than when it's catastrophic. But the contrast does tell you something about the relationship between language and institutional confidence. In 1916, the confidence was front-loaded. In the planning documents, in the pre-battle assessments, in the orders that told the men the wire would be cut. The result didn't match the confidence, and the diary entry was short. In 1918, the confidence arrived after the fact, earned by an operation that actually worked. "Everything went according to plan" is a sentence you can only write honestly once the plan has been executed and the plan has held. At Amiens, it did. It's worth pausing on that, not as vindication of any particular commander, but because the capacity of human institutions to improve, to actually learn, to actually change, to actually do better, is part of the historical record of the Western Front, alongside all the evidence of their failure. Both are real. Both are in the archive. The 100 days ended on the 11th of November. By then, Germany had lost the equivalent of its entire pre-war regular army twice over in the spring and summer fighting alone. The social and political infrastructure of the German home front, starved by the Royal Navy's blockade for 4 years, exhausted by war taxation and labour mobilisation, increasingly convulsed by revolutionary politics that were already producing mutinies in the German Navy and strikes in the industrial cities, had begun to dissolve. The Kaiser abdicated on the 9th of November. The German delegation signed the armistice terms in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest in the early hours of the 11th of November, at 5 o'clock in the morning. The ceasefire was set for 11 o'clock. The guns were scheduled to fire for 6 more hours. And they did. The other war. There's a short piece in the Women's Dreadnought, the newspaper that Sylvia Pankhurst published from the East End of London throughout the war, from a date in 1916 that I keep returning to. It isn't attributed to a named writer. It appears to be a letter from a reader, reprinted without comment. A woman writes that her wages at the shell-filling factory where she works are 22 shillings per week. Her male predecessor in the same job earned 38 shillings. She is filling the same shells, at the same rate, in the same building. She asks what she is supposed to do. Pankhurst's paper doesn't answer. It just prints the letter. That's silence. A newspaper that made its purpose the documentation of injustice, sitting in front of an injustice and having nothing to offer, is, to me, one of the more honest moments in the entire documentary record of the Western Front's home front. The question had no answer. The system was designed to produce that exact question and offer no route to its resolution. The mechanism was legal rather than simply customary. Ministry of Munitions Regulation 2, issued in 1915, stated that women performing work previously done by men were entitled to equal pay, but only if performing the identical task without any modifications whatsoever. Employers rapidly modified task specifications, slightly different tooling, a slightly different sequencing of operations, a slight reorganization of the work content. Nothing that changed the actual output. Everything that created the legal difference between identical task and modified task. The women filling shells were classified as performing a modified version of the men's work. The wage rate was set accordingly, at approximately 60% of the male equivalent. This was not a side effect of the mobilization. It was engineered, in specific legal language, by people who understood precisely what they were doing. The shells got made. The women got 22 shillings. The Barnbow factory on the outskirts of Leeds was National Filling Factory No. 1, the premier shell filling facility in Britain, employing a workforce of 16,000, the overwhelming majority of them women, working 3 shifts across a 24-hour day, 6 days a week. At 27 minutes past 10 on the night of the 5th of December, 1916, an explosion in room 42 killed 35 women immediately. The Ministry of Munitions suppressed the casualty report for the remainder of the war. The justification given in internal ministry correspondence was the preservation of production morale. That public knowledge of industrial fatalities on this scale would discourage recruitment to munitions work. The Internal Casualty Register described the dead as production losses. The phrase is in the document. I've referred to it before in an earlier chapter on the industrial scale of munitions production, and I'm referring to it again here deliberately because I think it belongs in both places. In the chapter about the machinery of shells, and in the chapter about the people who made them. The 35 women of Barnbow aren't a footnote to the shell crisis. They are part of the same story as the shells that killed men on the Somme. And the archive connects them, whether or not the official histories acknowledge the connection. The TNT that turned the Barnbow workers yellow, the toxic jaundice caused by trinitrotoluene absorption through the skin, through inhalation, through the simple daily proximity of packing explosive powder into steel casings without adequate protective equipment, operated on a body slowly, over weeks and months. The women who survived Barnbow often did so with liver damage that wasn't immediately visible and wouldn't become clinically obvious for years. The Canary Girl's nickname was, in its way, a piece of cultural normalization. A nickname lightens a thing, makes it speakable, gives the community that uses it a way of acknowledging the reality without requiring full confrontation with what the reality meant. These women had been turned yellow by industrial poisoning in service of a war that was killing their fathers and brothers and husbands at industrial rates. The nickname let the world look at them without looking directly at what had been done to them. The nickname survives. Most of the women's names don't. The Representation of the People Act became law in February of 1918. It gave the vote to all men over 21, which removed the property qualification that had previously denied the vote to many working-class men. and to women over 30 who met a specified property qualification. The property qualification for women meant that approximately 22% of women in munitions work, characteristically young, characteristically renting, characteristically working class, were excluded from the new franchise. These were, specifically, many of the women who had been filling shells and dying of TNT poisoning and surviving explosions for the previous 3 years. The historical debate about whether the act was a reward for women's wartime service or a carefully constructed compromise designed to prevent women outnumbering men on the electoral rolls is, in my reading of the evidence, not a debate that resolves cleanly. Both things are probably partly true. The act was genuinely transformative. Millions of women received the vote who hadn't had it before. It was also deliberately partial. The property qualification wasn't an oversight, and the age of 30 wasn't arbitrary. The complete franchise, women over 21 on equal terms with men, had to wait until 1928. The women who turned yellow packing shells in 1916 were, in many cases, still under 30 when the war ended. They didn't vote in the 1918 election. Sylvia Pankhurst is a figure who doesn't fit comfortably into the standard Western Front narrative, because the standard narrative is largely about the soldiers and the generals, and Pankhurst's war was neither soldierly nor generalish. She ran a newspaper. She ran a cost of living survey in working-class Poplar and Bow that documented, with the kind of specificity that makes abstract injustice concrete, exactly what it cost a family of 4 to survive on a soldier's wife's separation allowance in the winter of 1915. The rent, the coal, the food, the clothing, the school fees, the pennies that couldn't be stretched any further. Her survey found families in specific streets spending 6 or 7 shillings a week on food, less than the cost of manufacturing a single artillery shell casing. She documented this. She published it. She was not invited to any peace conference. She is not in any of the official histories. She is in the archive, which is a different kind of record. The women who were expelled from the industrial workforce in 1918 and 1919, pushed out of the munitions factories, the engineering shops, the transport roles, the clerical positions that they'd filled for 4 years, returned to the pre-war labour market categories that the war had temporarily suspended, didn't leave behind a documentary record of their individual experience of that process, in the same way that soldiers left letters and diaries. Some of them wrote. Most of them didn't, or their writing wasn't preserved, or it was preserved in places that researchers didn't systematically look for another generation or 2. What survives is the labour statistics. Female participation in British industrial employment, returning to 1914 levels in most categories by 1921. The transformation of wartime did not persist in the labour market. It was systematically reversed. What did persist was the political transformation. Women over 30 had the vote, and 10 years later, women over 21 had it. And the deeper social fact that 950,000 women had spent 4 years doing work that the culture had told them they couldn't do, and had done it. And the knowledge of that capability existed in the world in a way it hadn't before, even if the specific jobs were taken back. You can't unknow that women can fill shells, manage factories, drive buses, work as welders and crane operators and laboratory technicians. The culture tried to unknow it for a generation. It didn't entirely succeed. The separation allowance that soldiers' wives received while their husbands were on active service ran to between 12 and 17 shillings per week, depending on the number of children. Average working class rent in London during the war, 7 to 8 shillings a week. This left between 4 and 9 shillings per week for food, fuel, clothing, and every other expense for however many people were in the household. Pankhurst's survey in 1915 found families managing this, most of them, with the specific ingenuity that the very poor develop for surviving on amounts that the comfortable cannot imagine as sufficient. They were managing. They were not comfortable. The men on the Western Front, when they thought about home, and the letters show that they thought about it constantly, worried about this. They worried about whether the money was enough. They wrote home asking. They received letters back saying it was fine, because the letters home from wives to husbands on the Western Front tended toward reassurance rather than complaint, because the men were in the trenches, and the worry was that worry would break them. So the women managed, and worried alone, and wrote that it was fine. The archive holds both sides of that exchange. It's one of the more quietly painful things in it. The 100 years between the Barnbo explosion and 2026 have not entirely closed the questions it raised. Equal pay legislation in Britain was first passed as the Equal Pay Act in 1970, 54 years after the Ministry of Munitions used legal task modification to lock women's wages at 60% of men's equivalents. The gender pay gap in British manufacturing, as measured by the Office for National Statistics in the most recent data available, is approximately 15% in favour of men, across all categories. The mechanism has changed. It's no longer task reclassification in a munitions factory. It's the accumulation of part-time penalty, promotion differential, and occupational segregation. But the gap remains. The women of 1915 asked a question. The women of 2026 are still, in modified form, asking it. The Western Front didn't cause this continuity. It exposed it, with unusual clarity, in a context where the importance of women's labour was temporarily undeniable, and then it allowed the exposure to be covered back over when the context changed. 11 o'clock on the 11th. At 5 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of November 1918, in a railway carriage parked in the Compiègne forest about 60 miles northeast of Paris, a German delegation signed the armistice terms that ended the First World War. The ceasefire was specified to take effect at 11 o'clock on the same morning. There were 6 hours between the signing and the silence. The guns were not stopped at 5, they were stopped at 11. Because the orders said 11, and because the orders were the orders, and because nobody in the chain of command, from Foch's headquarters to the frontline battalions, made the decision to override 6 hours of scheduled killing with a single human judgment that the killing was no longer necessary. The armistice had been signed. The war was over. The shells were already loaded. Private First Class Henry Nicholas John Gunther was a 23-year-old soldier from Baltimore, Maryland, serving with the 313th Infantry Regiment of the United States 79th Division. He had been demoted from sergeant the previous month, and the specific circumstances of that demotion, a letter home describing the misery of conditions at the front that had been intercepted by military censors, suggest a man who was tired of the war in ways that had gotten him into official trouble. At 10:59 on the morning of the 11th of November, 1918, with 1 minute remaining before the ceasefire, Gunther charged a German machine gun position at a village called Chaumont devant Damvillers. The German soldiers, who, according to the post-war account from the German unit involved, were aware that the armistice was minutes away, reportedly waved him back and fired warning shots. He continued. They shot him at 10:59, 1 minute before the guns were scheduled to fall silent, and he was killed. He is recorded as the last known combat fatality of the First World War. He was restored to the rank of sergeant posthumously. The division's official account described his final action as a last heroic act. The German unit's account described it as bewildering and unnecessary. Between 5 in the morning and 11 in the morning, on the 11th of November, 1918, the 6 hours after the armistice was signed and before it came into effect, approximately 10,944 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured on the Western Front. Of these, 2,738 were fatalities. This figure comes from the post-war analysis of casualty records compiled by the United States Army, and it was documented in a study that was classified for a period after publication and is still not widely cited in mainstream histories of the armistice. The figure received wider public attention in 2004, when historian Joseph Persico included it in his book, 11th Month, 11th Day, 11th Hour, which is a good title for a study of a thing that should not have happened. 2,738 people. More than the American casualties on D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. On a morning when the war was already over. On a morning when the people killing them and dying among them knew, or could have known, that the war was over. The communications problem is real, and I want to be fair to it. The armistice order was transmitted from GHQ at approximately 45 minutes past 5 that morning, 45 minutes after the signing, by field telephone and telegraph to Army headquarters. Standard dissemination time from Army to Corps to Division to Brigade to Battalion ran approximately 2 to 4 hours, meaning that many frontline battalions didn't receive confirmed cessation orders until 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Orders to attack, issued the previous night, were already in execution. British military doctrine of the period required that confirmed orders not be countermanded without an explicit new order in writing. Some commanders, operating in the space between the old order and the new one, chose to continue. Some chose to halt. The 2,738 died in that space. They died in a communications gap, in the 6-hour window between a signed document in a forest railway carriage and a telephone call reaching a battalion headquarters in a shell-damaged farmhouse. The machinery of war had its own inertia. It didn't stop when someone signed a piece of paper. It stopped when the specific human beings responsible for each specific gun received a specific instruction and acted on it. General John Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces, had spent the preceding weeks actively opposing the armistice terms as insufficiently severe. He had written to the Supreme War Council, arguing that the Allies should continue fighting until Germany was occupied and completely defeated militarily, so that there could be no ambiguity about who had won. His position was overruled. The armistice was signed. But the AEF sector was the most actively engaged of all Allied commands on the morning of the 11th. Approximately 3,500 American casualties occurred on that day, more than the total American casualties at Omaha Beach. In the specific units that took the heaviest losses on the 11th of November, the attacks had been ordered after the armistice was known to have been signed in Paris, and in some cases after word of the signing had reached Corps headquarters. The orders continued anyway, because the orders had been given and the hour hadn't come yet, and the specific human judgment required to say, "This doesn't need to happen," wasn't exercised by the people who had the authority to exercise it. I want to sit with the scale of what this means without rushing past it. 2,738 people killed in 6 hours, after the war was over, because the machinery of the war had its own operational momentum that the war's end didn't instantly arrest. This is not a question of incompetence in the conventional sense. The generals and staff officers of the Western Front had spent 4 years operating in a system where the relationship between orders issued and men killed was accepted as the fundamental transaction of military command. The armistice changed the terms of that transaction from outside, in a forest in Compiègne, but it didn't immediately change the system's internal logic. The system kept doing what the system was designed to do. It fired shells until 11 o'clock, because 11 o'clock was when it was told to stop. Nobody who had the authority to stop it earlier chose to do so. And nobody who authorized the continuation of operations on the morning of the 11th was ever asked, formally or informally, to account for the decision. No senior Allied commander faced any formal inquiry about the November 11th casualties. No court-martial, no parliamentary committee, no military tribunal. The 1938 United States Army study that documented the 10,944 casualties was classified. It was available to researchers, but was not cited in official histories. Persico's 2004 book brought it to wider attention, and in 2025, the figure was cited before a United States Senate subcommittee examining military ethics and the doctrine of meaningful human control over weapons systems. 107 years after the events it describes, the November 11th question entered legislative testimony as an argument about autonomous weapons and the specific human obligation to stop killing when killing is no longer necessary. The armistice morning was used as a proof of what happens when command systems prioritize institutional momentum over individual human judgment. The senators who heard the testimony were sitting in a building that didn't exist in 1918. The question they were being asked was the same question the 11th of November asks. Who is responsible when the machinery continues after the reason for the machinery has ended? Sergeant Archibald Mackindoe of the Royal Scots Fusiliers wrote in his diary on the 11th of November 1918. At 11, the guns stopped. The silence was like a wall. Men looked at each other and said nothing. I think some of us had forgotten what it sounded like. That sentence, I think some of us had forgotten what it sounded like, is the most precise description of what 4 years of continuous artillery sound had done to the people who lived inside it that I found in the primary record. Not that the silence was welcome, not that it was a relief, that it was unfamiliar, that the men standing in it at 11 o'clock couldn't quite locate the reference point in memory for what silence meant, because they'd been living inside industrial noise for so long that silence had become the absence of something rather than a thing in itself. The war had, in this specific and verifiable physiological sense, changed what its survivors' nervous systems registered as normal. The silence at 11 was not peace. It was the removal of something that had been there so long it had ceased to be noticed. The same mud, the same wire. There is a sentence in Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June, 1919, that is 53 words long and may be the most consequential sentence written in the 20th century. It reads, Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. 53 words. Drafted by a young American lawyer named John Foster Dulles, who would later serve as Secretary of State under Eisenhower, as a legal mechanism for enabling the reparations clauses that followed it. The clause was not intended, Dulles later acknowledged, as a moral verdict. It was a legal fiction inserted to solve a balance sheet problem. Under the international law of the time, reparations could only be assessed against a party found legally responsible for initiating a conflict, and the complex web of 1914 alliance obligations made legal responsibility genuinely ambiguous. So the clause was written to create the legal finding that the reparations required, regardless of whether the historical facts supported an unambiguous assignment of war guilt to Germany alone. Dulles wrote it as a lawyer. It was read by Germany as a verdict. A German newspaper ran the headline the day after the signing, "We will never forget this shame." It was not wrong about how the clause would be experienced. It was wrong about whether forgetting, or its alternative, was what followed. John Maynard Keynes had attended the Paris Peace Conference as a British Treasury delegate and resigned in protest at the reparations terms. He went home and in a few months wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in December of 1919, which argued with forensic precision that the reparations bill, assessed by the London Schedule of Payments in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, roughly 33 billion United States dollars at the time, was economically unworkable, would destabilize the German economy and currency, and would create the political conditions for something worse than the war that had just ended. He was correct. He was called defeatist by Clemenceau's France and insufficiently patriotic by the British press. He was correct anyway. The Weimar Republic, trying to meet reparations payments it couldn't afford, resorted to printing money. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the savings of the German middle class. The Great Depression of the 1930s destroyed the jobs of the German working class. The political space created by these two consecutive catastrophes was filled, in 1933, by a man who had a simple explanation for all of it. Germany had been betrayed, from within, and the betrayers must be identified and destroyed. Adolf Hitler had been 29 years old, recovering from gas-induced temporary blindness in a military hospital, when he heard about the armistice in November of 1918. His later account of that moment described it as a personal catastrophe, a rupture in his understanding of the world. He spent the next 15 years building a political movement on the specific wound that the Treaty of Versailles had opened and kept open. The wound was real. The explanation he offered for it was a lie. The lie was effective precisely because it substituted a clear villain, a conspiracy, an internal betrayal, for the complex and documented reality that Germany had run out of men, food, allies, and industrial capacity, and had lost the war because the Allied coalition was larger and had more resources, and had eventually, painfully, learned to use them. The Western Front's territorial legacy is, in cold outline, surprisingly modest given what it cost. France recovered Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces lost in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Belgium's neutrality was reaffirmed. Germany lost approximately 13% of its pre-war territory and 10% of its population to successor states and Allied occupation. Poland was reconstituted as a nation. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were dissolved and replaced by a collection of successor states whose borders were drawn, in many cases, in ways that created new minority populations and new sources of grievance that the 20th century would spend decades processing. These were real changes, but the Western Front specifically, the 440-mile line that absorbed the majority of the killing, produced, as its primary territorial outcome, essentially a return to the approximate Franco-German border of the 1870s. The men who died in Flanders fields died, most of them, for ground that was already French or Belgian in 1914. The ground was worth defending. The question of whether it was worth the mechanism of its defense is different and harder. The demographic void is the most invisible of the war's legacies and the most pervasive. British demographic surveys after the war identified a specific cohort gap in the male population aged 20 to 40 in 1920. A measurable depression in the curve, visible in the census data, representing approximately 702,000 men killed and a further 1,600,000 permanently disabled. This wasn't an abstraction. It appeared in the marriage rate data, the birth rate data, the labor force composition data of the following 2 decades. Specific industries reported specific shortages of experienced workers in specific age cohorts through the 1920s and 30s that traced directly back to the specific age profile of men who had been killed or disabled between 1914 and 1918. The generation that would have been in its peak productive years in the 1930s was the generation that the Western Front had specifically consumed. The Great Depression hit Britain at the precise moment that the surviving members of that generation were entering middle age, with the specific mixture of physical damage, psychological damage, and absent peers that the war had left behind. Germany made its final reparations payment on the 3rd of October 2010. It was a payment of approximately 69.9 million euros, under the terms of the 1953 London Debt Agreement, which had rescheduled Germany's remaining obligations after the Second World War. Germany had been paying, in various forms and under various reschedulations, for 92 years. The total amount actually paid, across all the reschedulations and cancellations and adjustments, was approximately 21 billion gold marks, roughly 16% of the original assessment. The reparations did not rebuild France and Belgium, whose reconstruction was financed primarily by domestic government borrowing. They did not stabilize the German economy, they destabilized it. They did produce, in the political and economic chaos of Weimar Germany, the specific conditions that enabled a movement built on grievance and conspiracy to acquire mass support. Keynes was right. The war was won in 1918. The peace was lost in 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, in the specific 53 words that John Foster Dulles wrote to solve a legal problem without fully reckoning with the political weight those words would carry in the specific country they were addressed to. The last surviving combat veteran of the First World War was Claude Stanley Choules, a British-born Royal Navy serviceman who had witnessed the scuttling of the German fleet at Scapa Flow in 1919 and had afterwards emigrated to Australia. He died on the 5th of May 2011 at a nursing home in Perth at the age of 110. He had spent most of his long life saying very little about the war. His daughter persuaded him to write a memoir when he was 108. The book appeared in print, and in one interview given around that time, when asked what the war had been about, he said he genuinely did not know. He wasn't being evasive, he wasn't performing modesty. He was a man who had been there, who had 92 years of subsequent living in which to reflect on it, and who at 108, in full possession of his faculties, said that he didn't know what it had been for. I think that answer deserves more respect than most of the confident retrospective explanations that historians and politicians have offered in its place. Not because it's the right answer, because it's the honest one. This series has been, from its first chapter, organized around the subtitle's provocation. 4 years of hell that produced 10 million corpses and changed nothing. I want to end with the precise version of that claim, because the imprecise version, that the Western Front accomplished nothing, that the killing was meaningless, that nothing changed, is not quite true and not quite false. And the truth is in the gap between those two positions. Things changed. The map of Europe changed. The empires changed. The social contracts of every participating nation changed, in ways that are still visible in 2026. In women's suffrage, in labour rights, in the welfare state that Britain began constructing in the 1940s, in direct response to the broken promises of 1918. The technology of warfare changed, permanently. The laws of war changed, in slow and contested increments, through the Geneva Conventions and the laws of armed conflict that the Western Front's specific horrors generated. These are not nothing, but the conditions that produced the war, great power competition, the treatment of national humiliation as a political resource, the organization of young men as expendable industrial inputs for the ambitions of states, those conditions were not resolved by the Treaty of Versailles. They were, in specific and documentable ways, made worse. 20 years later, the same map hosted a conflict that killed 55 million people, built deliberately on the specific grievances that the peace of 1919 had manufactured and left unaddressed. The Western Front was not the cause of the Second World War, but it planted the specific seeds, in the clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, in the humiliation of the German delegation in the Hall of Mirrors, in the economic consequences that Keynes had predicted and been ignored for predicting, that the Second World War eventually harvested. The field at Passchendaele is green now. The grass grows over ground that contains 10 to 12 million unexploded shells and the biochemical residue of the men who died there. The cemeteries are immaculate. The headstones are uniform. White stone, standard dimensions, name and regiment and date if known. If not known, A soldier of the Great War, known unto God. There are hundreds of thousands of those, known unto God. The iron harvest continues. 200 to 300 tons of unexploded ordnance recovered from the Western Front Zone every year in 2026, more than a century after the last shell was fired. Belgian bomb disposal teams, French agricultural officials, farmers who still plough up the past with their spring tilling. The ground hasn't finished with the war. The war hasn't finished with the ground. Claude Schul said he didn't know what it was for. The ground of northern France and Belgium, which is still chemically hostile in places, still giving up its iron dead, might be the most honest answer available. It was for this specific transformation of land into something that cannot entirely recover. This specific investment of human life and industrial capacity in the production of a result that required, 20 years later, another and larger version of itself to address the conditions it created. That is the record. The archive is very large, and it is very specific, and it holds all of this. The heroism, and the planning failures, and the institutional courage, and the criminal indifference. The 35 women at Barnbow, and the 12 lines in Haig's diary, and the pigeon at Fort Vaux, and Henry Gunther at 1059, and the 53 words that John Foster Dulles wrote on a Tuesday in Paris in 1919 that helped end one war by planting the next one. It's all in there. The archive doesn't judge, it simply holds.